This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
We got a mixed tape out there. The S&P off about 0.1%. The Dow up 0.8%. The Nasdaq down 0.6%. So no real direction when you look at the indexes here. Yields, they are higher. 10-year Treasury up 7 basis points, 4.32% on your 10-year. Crude oil pulling back just a little bit, off about 0.5%, $77.40. OPEC talking about cutting production by another 1 million barrels, but not having the desired impact there. Gold a little bit lower here, $2,035 an ounce for gold. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Amy Morris has got world and national news for us.
All right, thank you, Paul. Indicted New York Representative George Santos faces expulsion from Congress, a vote that could come as early as today. Earlier, he launched into a litany of innuendo about wrongdoing by other lawmakers, noting that he has yet to be convicted of anything.
So if I am to get expelled tomorrow, I will be number 6 in the history, the first Republican and the only one without a conviction or without being part of or without having committed treason.
Santos also suggested he may return to public service someday. This new effort to expel Santos from the House was precipitated by a damning ethics report outlining a pattern of campaign lies, alleged theft, and refusal to cooperate with investigators. And he faces a 23-count criminal indictment, including charges of wire fraud and identity theft. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has died. He defined American foreign policy during the 1970s. Bloomberg News managing editor Derek Walbank says he was a polarizing figure.
Kissinger was described as an old friend of the Chinese people. There's a mournful reaction from China. At the same time, this is somebody who throughout parts of Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, etc., is not held in anywhere the same sort of thing. So very polarizing.
Bloomberg News managing editor Derek Walbank. Kissinger was 100 years old. The White House South Lawn now has an ice skating rink to celebrate the holidays. First Lady Jill Biden unveiled the rink.
What's more magical and wonderful and joyful than, being on an ice rink in the South Lawn of the White House? Who knew, right?
Military families, first responders, and other special invited guests will enjoy the White House skating rink in December. It will not be open to the public. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Molly.
Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. All right, so Molly, talk to me about this story that's in The Athletic. Tennis's Grand Slams plot deal for premier tour that would revolutionize the sport. What's going on here? I've got the Grand Slams. What else do I need?
Well, there's so much more in the world of tennis, Paul, than just the Grand Slams.
Oh.
You're limiting yourself to just 4 tournaments a year when there are dozens more.
All right, so what do they want to do?
So I'm still getting up to speed on this myself, but my understanding is that right now, the tennis calendar is just so jam-packed. There are so many events, the Grand Slams obviously being the biggest and the most lucrative to compete in. Then there is a series below that of 9 tournaments that are what we call 1,000 level events. So those are just one round shorter than a Grand Slam would be. Also extremely elite, draw all of the top players in the world. And there are a couple more buckets below that are then players are competing for fewer ranking points and less prize money. And it's right now what the officials on both the women's and men's tour are trying to do is to condense the schedule a bit because it is just so jam-packed and it's tough for the players to maintain their fitness, their health, and also spectators to follow along. It's just, there are people like me who look at this day in and day out for 365 days a year, and other people more like you, probably the general public, who really just follow the slams. So I want to try to meet more in the middle and get everybody just an easier experience to participate in and to watch.
It feels like a little bit of a response to what we saw happen or we see happen in golf right now with the Live Tour and all the disruption that has played and the money pouring into golf. I'm guessing the folks at tennis are saying we're probably leaving a lot of money on the table. If we can maybe enhance our product.
Yeah, and there is actually a similar concern of the Saudis coming into tennis as well, that they're plotting to try to get a really big tournament on the calendar on their home soil, and that would really be disruptive to some of the others that are during that time of year right now.
All right, we'll keep on top of that. Molly certainly will. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to get the latest on the global energy space. OPEC, I don't know, they're cutting output again. So we'll get the latest there. Fernando Valle, he's the analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He covers the global energy space. He'll join us. Then we're going to talk a little healthcare. We got another M&A trade in the healthcare space. Cigna and Humana talking about getting together. Glenn Losa, healthcare analyst of Bloomberg Intelligence, will help us break it down. And it is Thursday. That means we talk to one, Barry Ritholtz, founder of Ritholtz Wealth Management, host of Masters in Business. No idea what we're going to talk about, but we will wing it because Barry is conversant on so many different issues as it relates to these markets. We're going to kick this off with John Tucker, who's got a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Paul Molly, the major stock averages, they have turned mixed, and we have a couple of head scratchers. OPEC Plus announcing production cuts, sent oil higher. For now, for the first time this morning, WTI turned negative on the day. It looks like traders don't like the fact that cuts won't be formalized into official output targets, but there are smarter people who will be along to try to explain that. Traders also giving a lukewarm response to data that bolstered bets the Fed's done with its hiking cycle, and Treasury yields are, well, they're actually higher on that data. Meantime, Russ Kosterich at BlackRock says stocks can push higher.
Rates are coming down. Inflation appears to be moderating, but there's still not evidence, or at least not a lot of evidence, that the economy is going to slow so quickly that you've got to really be concerned about a recession in early 24. Our view is the economy is slowing, but it's relatively stable, and we're going to see growth into the first half of next year.
And Apple facing a revived probe in Europe over its dominance in mobile browsers and cloud gaming. Its shares right now among the most active, down about 0.3%. S&P 500 is still on track for one of its biggest November gains on record. Right now, the S&P 500 2 points higher at 4553. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 317 points. The Nasdaq 100 is down 100 points, a decline of 0.6%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Molly and Paul.
John Tucker, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming live on YouTube. I think that's what they call it, right?
That's the one. Yeah,
that's
the
one.
internet.
YouTube.com. Go over to YouTube and search Bloomberg Radio. All right, yet another reason why I could never be an oil trader. OPEC announces they're going to cut production. I buy oil because I think it's going up. It's off 1%. I have no idea what's going on.
My head is spinning.
It's just crazy. But we know somebody who knows this stuff. Fernando Valle, he's a global energy analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. What's going on here, Fernando?
Well, Paul, it's a lot of headlines and not enough commitment, especially because about half of these quotas that they've talked of, the 1 million, are probably for countries that are already producing below the levels that they're targeting anyway. They don't have the capacity to produce at the levels they're targeting, so they don't really reflect oil that's coming off the market. And then if you consider seasonality, the seasonality also says most of the OPEC countries burn oil during the summer when it's very warm in the Middle East for power generation. So if they're cutting now when they are not using that oil for power generation, the impact on the export's not that great because their own internal consumption is low. So the oil on the market is actually not falling nearly as much as the 1 million barrels a day suggests.
Seems like one of the bigger headlines that came out of this was that Brazil is considering an invite to join the OPEC Plus alliance next year. What's there to consider if you're
Brazilian? You know.
Well, yeah, that's
How
right.
come you guys weren't I thought you guys were already in OPEC.
We're not. Only Latin American country is Venezuela, but it's not something that really has any effect because although Brazil is the largest shareholder in Petrobras, they are not allowed technically to tell Petrobras how much to produce. So they, as opposed to a Sonangol for Angola or Saudi Aramco for Saudi Arabia, the Brazilian government can't actually tell Petrobras to cut production.
So who does Petrobras answer to?
There's a law that requires them to be fiduciary duties to their minority shareholders. So they do answer to the Brazilian government, but they have a fiduciary duty to their minority shareholders, and this would not be in their best interest. They've actually been sued in the U.S. because of that. They lost. They had to make a settlement because they were going against fiduciary duties.
So what are your thoughts then if they would take up OPEC Plus on the invitation?
I think it would be a bit toothless. They can't actually join on quotas. They could try to coordinate, but there's very little the government can actually affect within Petrobras's production. And remember, there are a lot of other producers in Brazil as well. So they would have to coordinate with a lot of publicly traded companies that are not Brazilian.
So Petrobras, PETR4 space BZ equity, is that the ticker?
They have 4 tickers.
Well,
one is not enough.
One is not. I guess it just goes to my question, which I can't. It's got 479 billion market cap. I don't know. Is that dollars? That's dollars?
Yeah,
so that's big.
Yes.
That's reals.
That's reais. That's just for the preferred.
What? The currency there. Reais.
Reais.
Wait, come back again.
Pardon my Brazilian, my Portuguese. Excuse me.
Spell it for me.
REAIS.
I didn't hear an R when you said it aloud.
Hey, as opposed to reais.
So it's more of a silent R.
It's like an H.
Reais. So that's 470 reais. What's that in dollars?
So that's just under $100 billion for the preferred, and then with the ordinary, they're close to just under 200 billion.
So they're big, but relative to like Exxon and all that kind of stuff.
They're about half of Exxon as far as market cap, but they produce about 80% of Exxon's output.
80%. Okay. All right. So let's step back here. Oil. Where's it going? Mike McGlone says it's going to 50. Now he's just a trader. Who knows what he's doing?
So I think the biggest question is still demand, and you keep saying soft landing, and the biggest is not OPEC, and we keep saying this. OPEC's trying to fight the Fed. You can't fight the Fed. You don't have that balance sheet, and at the end of the day, the biggest indicator for oil prices is probably the 210 spread as opposed to what OPEC is saying. You can see that they're a bit toothless with their announcements, and it's losing a lot of ground because cuts themselves aren't bullish. You're just creating more spare capacity. So if you can come back within 3-4 months, do you really have a problem with supply?
And when you see then that crude right now is down, this is WTI futures are down like 0.6 on the day. I mean, what do you think was maybe the most negative headline coming out of this right now that's driving the market?
Well, I think it's that there's no concrete evidence that they will actually reduce supply. So even their announcement it's again a bit toothless. And then our focus is really how is the consumer, the U.S. consumer, the Chinese consumer, the European consumer going to emerge from this current higher interest rates, higher inflation scenario, and that's the biggest issue because as you see, credit delinquencies, auto delinquencies rising. Home affordability at their lowest level in 30 years. Summer driving season is really summer building season. You get all the contractors out driving a lot, and if we are not having that kind of activity, then we will suffer.
I just filled up the Beamer at $3.15 a gallon down in the Jersey Shore. How about that?
That's
Which
regular?
just means you're driving more.
What's that?
That's regular or premium?
Regular. I'm not doing premium. I rent
Well,
my BMW. Now,
I mean,
Matt Miller,
some of
don't
them
tell
will-
Matt Miller because he wants me to put like the super premium in my car.
That's why I drive a Kia.
Yeah, I drive a Kia. Great. I figure that actually makes some sense.
Or you could get a Cybertruck and just charge it right
No,
up.
I'm not doing the Cybertruck. I have no idea what that is. All right, Fernando, thanks for stopping in. Appreciate it. Bringing us up to date. Everything we know about the energy business, we learned from Fernando Valle. He's the energy dude at Bloomberg Intelligence. I hired him. I did not hire this dude. I have no idea who he is, but he's going to talk to us about Cigna merging, yet another healthcare merger.
We cannot get enough.
I mean, again, I'm coming back in my next life as a big pharma M&A banker. They just get paid every single week, it seems like. Glenn Losev joins us. He's the healthcare analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. He joins in 2019, so that's like so late. We started BI in 2008.
Oh, he's a newcomer. Welcome, Glenn.
Thanks for coming in, Glenn. Hey, talk to us about this deal here. Cigna, Humana, who's left here to merge in your business?
Right. Well, first of all, it's not finalized yet, right?
Okay.
The Wall Street Journal broke the story yesterday that they're in discussions to merge. You know, if this happens, it's going to be out of 6 large health insurance companies publicly traded, it's going to be 5.
So what's the rationale for these companies getting together?
So
every Monday we wake up and there's another healthcare merger.
So insurance business, if it's healthcare insurance or any other insurance, it's all about scale, right? And the larger the company, the more margin then they can squeeze. The rationale here especially is the combination of Cigna's PBM, Express Script, and Humana's Medicare Advantage for Medicare beneficiaries, which is Humana is the 2nd largest Medicare provider in the United States. So there's would be a huge cross benefit between one of the largest PBMs in the business and one of the largest Medicare Advantage providers.
And if I'm somebody right now who's insured by Cigna or Humana, what should I care most about?
To tell you honestly, it's not going to affect a beneficiary per se, if you have coverage or not. Going forward, if it happens, there could be some challenges to what kind of benefits you can get. But usually the larger scale companies can offer more benefit than a smaller one.
All right. I feel like every time these deals come up, I don't necessarily need to talk to the healthcare analyst. I need to talk to Jennifer Reed, the antitrust analyst.
That's very true.
You're just saying if this deal goes through, we'll go from 6 big insurance companies in that space down to 5. Right. What are the regulators going to say, do you think?
So that's another thing. So my gut feeling, and as you said, Jen Rhee is an X in this, but my gut feeling that it will take at least a year and possibly 2 years if it passes, and there is a huge scrutiny from the government right now for it not to pass. Government is scrutinizing PBMs, basically saying that PBM companies like Cigna have too much power over drug costs and so on and so forth. So government sort of is against it. Overlap between 2 companies is not too big, so legally I think they can get it done, but we'll see what happens. But nevertheless, it's going to take at least 1 year until we know, or on a way to know if it's going to pass or not.
And these guys are still nowhere near the size of a United Health, right? That's still very much the top dog.
United is the biggest company, and even if this Cigna-Humana combination comes, it's still going to be...
Who do we have?
Half.
We have here, we have Cigna is our dental insurance, and then we have Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield for medical and health coverage.
Right. Good to know.
Yeah.
All right. So you step back from this deal. What are what's the business like for the health insurance business? I mean, I kind of feel like even if the economy slows, I mean, John Tucker's still going to go to the doctor. You know, I mean, he's got to take care of that rickety old.
That's actually, that's a consensus view that's actually not true.
Really?
So healthcare does slow down with the economy. And based on 2008 sort of Great Recession numbers, the demand for care was down for the 6 years after 2008 crash.
Really? Okay.
So health insurance will still be in business, will still make money, healthcare providers will still make money, but the demand for care will certainly drop if we enter recessionary environment.
When you talk about how scale is the most important part of this business, I mean, is it the idea then that as an insurer, when you have larger size, that you can then be negotiating with the actual health providers because you have so many consumers who are under your plans that you can then negotiate a priority rate? That's the idea?
That's the idea, basically, yes. But, you know, it's...
So wouldn't that benefit a consumer then? No?
Well, there is some benefit, but also health insurers are being pressured by, healthcare providers like hospitals are being pressured by higher costs of labor, compensation costs, so they're not gonna provide care if they're not gonna generate margins. So it's always back and forth push. Every 3 years, companies, health insurance companies and providers renegotiate their contracts. Larger scale companies, as you mentioned, health insurance companies have more leverage, obviously, but you know, at the end of the day, everyone wants to stay profitable.
What are just the broad regulatory risks for these health insurance companies? Nobody likes health insurance companies.
Yeah, it's always one of those things that, you know, something will come and, you know, change the industry. My view on this is that usually law changes in a way where it can actually sort of change the industry. You know, it takes 10, 15 years. And I always bring an example that Obamacare, ACA, was originally introduced by Hillary Clinton in 1993, and it took 17 years for it to become the law in 2010. So there could be changes, some negative, mostly negative, but to really change how the healthcare is offered in the United States, it takes
How do you
years.
compare our healthcare system versus, I don't know, Canada or the UK? I mean, people come over here and they say, you guys are crazy over here. But I'm like, isn't ours the best? I don't know how to compare it.
So I've never lived in Canada or UK, but...
How about Russia?
I've been here for a very long time, for 30 years. So, and you don't want me to compare anything to Russian healthcare 30 years ago. But you know, I mean, I think everyone pays approximately the same amount of money, right? In the UK and Canada, you pay much higher taxes. Here, we pay for insurance and co-pays and so on and so forth. But at the same time, here in the United States, in New York, if I'm sick, I can go to a doctor within 20 minutes, right? Yep. In the UK, if you need a hip replacement, you have to wait, I've read 6 months, a year. Right. MRIs, same thing in Canada. So, you know, based on my sort of experience where I grew up, based on what I've read about UK and Canada, I think United States, healthcare in the United States is still the best one.
Yeah, I don't see people going to other countries to get stuff done, do I? But people come
maybe
here
some very sus elective procedures.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, no, but I don't think
Mexico?
anything run of the mill. That
Yeah.
no, I don't think you're going elsewhere to get a hip replacement.
All right, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. Glenn Losov, healthcare analyst, Bloomberg Intelligence, post me in BI, but I think he passed, right? We'll keep him back.
Oh yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, Glenn, thanks so much for joining us. Another deal in the healthcare space, this time in insurance. Cigna and Humana merger, big business there. So I guess it's all about scale. It's like on so many industries we hear people come in and say, it's all about scale.
Another deal, another day.
Yeah, another deal, another day. S&P 500 unched on the day. And the S&P is unched, and then the Dow's up about 0.9%. The NASDAQ off about 0.5% there. Yields higher. 10-year Treasuries up 6 basis points, 4.32%. I'm going to call out the VIX for Tom Keene, 13.21, still muted. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Shares of Salesforce, they are higher after cost-cutting measures helped the management software maker deliver better results. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle says the company is having its best day since March of this year.
It was mainly profits, adjusted earnings by 19%. They put up $1.38 in adjusted earnings. They also raised the profit range, the outlook. In August, they cut jobs. That followed a 10% staff reduction earlier this year. The goal was profitability. They achieved it, revenue beating, but just very slightly.
Salesforce up about 6%. Grocery chain Kroger delivered a cautious outlook. Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld has the breakdown.
The third quarter, it was all right, but it was the guidance that was a little bit disappointing here. Specifically, you take a look at Kroger's third quarter adjusted EPS. That came in at 95 cents. The estimate had been for 91 cents. You also had sales a touch better than expected. But then you look ahead, Kroger's, it did narrow its adjusted EPS range, but the upper end is still the same. And the grocery chain also lowered its guidance for full year same-store sales.
Kroger right now up about 2.5%. And TD Bank missed analysts' estimates or earnings estimates. The lender said it set aside more money than expected for potentially souring loans, and it pointed to a restructuring charge that was related to a planned 3% workforce cut. Now, TD Bank also dealing with the DOJ investigation about its compliance with anti-money laundering rules. Shares right now, they're down about 1.5%. And on the flip side, Royal Bank of Canada beat analysts' earnings estimates after reporting strong capital markets performance and a tax adjustment in the company's favor. RBC right now, they're up about 2.5%. I'm Lisa Mateo. This
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom. This Bloomberg Business Flash. This on a day when we're seeing maybe some signs of buyer exhaustion after the rally that's put the S&P 500 less than 5% away from its all-time high. But right now, the S&P 500 4 points lower. That's down 0.1% at 45.46. And as you're just talking, one of the best performing industry groups in the S&P 500, healthcare, the biggest drag coming from communication services. Shares of Immunogen, they're up 81%. AbbVie agreeing to acquire Immunogen for $10.1 billion. And more data today, consumer spending increasing just 0.2% during October, the weakest showing since March. Also, the measure of inflation tied to the spending report also moderating. Personal income growth, that slowed as well. Still, the two-year yield is higher. That's up 4 basis points at 4.69. S&P 500, again, 3 points lower, 45.47. The Dow up 313 points. NASDAQ 100 is down 120 points right now. You know what day it is today?
What day is it?
Well, it's November 30th. That would make it 11/30 day. And coming up in New York, Eastern Time, it'll be 11:30 in 7 minutes. So 11:30 and 11:30, and our frequency is 11:30.
Wow.
And in our New York frequency, anyway. At least in the radio, for radio geeks like Barry and myself, that's a big deal.
Isn't like 99.9% of our listenership from like streaming and stuff like that?
Well, yeah, but there are a few of us who still have Philco radios in our car.
And our good friends on YouTube. Hello to everybody there.
Absolutely right.
Happy 11/30 day.
Happy 11.
Should we just like dance for a minute then? Like,
No,
let's
we're
just
going to have
celebrate?
fireworks in 6 minutes.
Exactly.
All right.
Get moving on that.
Stay tuned.
All right, Barry, thank you very much, John Tucker. We appreciate that. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, 11:30 a.m. If you're in New York City and you've got one of those AM radios, check it out. We're also streaming on YouTube, which is where the kids are, youtube.com. Check it out. Barry Ritholtz joins us, the host of Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio. He's also Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of Ritholtz Wealth Management. He's mastered this Zoom thing, so why come into the studio? I always say. Barry, market's up 10, 11% in November. Are you buying it? What's going on here?
You know, we're long-term investors, we're asset allocators, and so we try not to time the market. If you wait for everything to look perfect, you're going to be waiting forever. Remember, about a year ago, last October, November of 2022, people were in a full panic that, hey, you know, this 20% drawdown in the S&P is going to get much worse. Well, we made that up and then some. And if you were fortunate enough to be exposed to the NASDAQ, well, you've done twice as well. So it's really all but impossible to time this. You just have to think about equities in terms of decades, not days.
Well, these days, I mean, what is exciting to you about equities? And if you had to put maybe $100 million or something, or however much you're managing these days, where would you put it right now?
So many different ways to answer that question. What's really the most exciting thing to me about this market today is this could be the most widely hated rally since the post-09 recovery, since the move off of 2009, 2010. Early this week, I was writing about what I recall from the markets in 2011. And if you remember that era, everybody hated equities. So many people just hated stocks. And there were so many arguments about, well, this is a dead cat bounce. We're going to have hyperinflations. Inflation will never go away. Equities aren't cheap, like excuse after excuse. This isn't exactly parallel, but 2011 was about 32 months after the March 09 bottom. Now we're about 40 months after the pandemic lows with a whole lot more fiscal stimulus and higher rates, not falling rates. But this is every bit as hated of a rally as what we saw in the post-financial crisis era. And when I see disbelief and anger and refusal to see what the market is showing you right in front of your own eyes, that tends to be bullish over the long haul.
So for you, Barry, I know you guys at Edward Holtz Wealth Management, you're putting a wrap on 2023. How are you guys thinking about, I don't know if you do this, kind of just thinking about 2024 thematics? Where do we want to be? Do we want to be, underweight equities or overweight fixed? I mean, how do you think about that? Here we are as we get ready to get into December.
Sure, great question. We always look at risk versus reward. That's the key issue with us. Back in 2022, we didn't see a whole lot of reward in fixed income, especially longer duration fixed income. And so we shortened up our duration on the bond portion of our portfolio, on the fixed income portion. And listen, nobody's happy to see, big drawdowns in their fixed income portion. But falling 10, 11% was much better than what the index did. In the end of the third quarter, we began lengthening our duration in fixed income because you're now getting paid 4.5%, 5% if you want to take very little risk, and more if you want to take greater risk, to think about bonds and to actually capture some yield. Recall last year, everybody was talking about the death of the 60-40 portfolio. Well, it's hard to call this dead if you're going to look at a big portion of your portfolio. 40% is going to get 5%. And if you are in the right state, if you have a relatively high quality credit for your state, and I'm thinking about states like California, New York, the Carolinas, not Jersey. Jersey comes up negative on a screen, as does Illinois.
Really?
But
Please.
Connecticut, Massachusetts,
Best pizza
states
around.
that seem to be fairly well run, you're getting 7, 8, 9% tax equivalent yield from their muni bonds. And so, look, we're still long equities. We're long-term holders of equities. But we've been very skeptical about bonds for a couple of years, and this is the year where that changes. Even if rates continue to go up, even if the Fed is telling us the truth and rates are going to go higher, at least start legging in. I'm skeptical that's going to happen. I think this might be a great entry for fixed income for the next couple of years, especially if people like Goldman Sachs are right and we start to see, or Bill Ackman, we see cuts either the first quarter or the second half of next year. This is a pretty good place to expand on your fixed income, especially munis, if you're in the right place. Doesn't mean abandon equities, especially if you have a time horizon of longer than next Tuesday. But bonds have become really the most interesting story of 2023.
And probably to your point then for 2024. So what are you then thinking when you hear people at Goldman Sachs and Bill Ackman saying that the Fed may cut as early as first quarter, second quarter of next year? And if it is going to be that soon, does that to you sound like it's because we're on path for a soft landing or more heading toward a recession?
So I apologize in advance for everything I'm about to say. But
all right, that's a great disclaimer to start the answer.
I think of two things. The first thing I think of is nobody knows anything. Just think about every year when we go through this exercise of the year ahead. Nobody in late 2019 was talking about a pandemic shutting down the global economy. Nobody was talking very much about Russia invading Ukraine the following year, and oil finishing the year lower. And I don't recall anybody at the end of 21 saying, hey, down double digits, both in stocks and bonds. So let's just all admit we have no idea what the future is going to hold. The second thing I think about when I hear this forecast that completely agree with my position and belief in our portfolios is today in confirmation bias, let me only read the people who agree with what I say. And that's a problem that all investors have. We have a tendency to seek out that which tells us we're right, how smart we are. And it's a challenge when I read something from Goldman Sachs that totally agrees with my positioning, I have to go find something from Morgan Stanley that says, no, you're completely wrong. Here's what's going to happen. just to kind of keep yourself honest. Otherwise, we create these little bubbles, these little media bubbles around ourselves where we're only finding the things that confirm our priors. Really, if Charlie Munger taught us anything, it's constantly challenge your own beliefs.
Barry, real quick, 3 p.m. today, Eastern Time, Tesla's going to release the Cybertruck. Thoughts?
Yes, so I'm a big car guy. I go to a lot of car events. I asked a bunch of pickup owners at a sports car event, so maybe this wasn't precisely the right audience, what they thought of it, and there was a lot of skepticism. My favorite quote was, "It's a clown car." Maybe that's a little harsh. As it turns out, Elon isn't the greatest when it comes to the human side of things like social media, but he's a tough guy to bet against when it comes to physics. Look what he's done in the EV space. Look what he's done with SpaceX. I personally think the Cybertruck is just too damn ugly, and it's tough to go that far ahead of the public. You have to advance the public a little bit, but not too far. It'll be interesting. Look, unusual for Tesla.
Right.
They find themselves behind.
I know. Yeah. Some of the players.
Right, behind the Ford Lightning, which is cheap, and way behind the Rivian, which is a fantastic luxurious pickup.
All right, Barry, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Barry Ritholtz, host of Masters in Business. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C., World and National News with Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. An appeals court has reinstated a gag order to block Donald Trump from disparaging court staff at his New York civil fraud trial. An affidavit written by an officer of the court accused the former president of escalating his attacks on members of the court since the gag order was lifted earlier this month, resulting in, quote, hundreds of harassing and threatening messages to members of the court staff, including the judge's wife and his law clerk. Israel and Hamas agreed to lengthen their truce for at least another day, allowing for the release of more hostages held by the militant group in Gaza. We get more now with Bloomberg's Lisa Fleischer.
The truce was extended basically last minute, like 5 minutes before the 7 a.m. deadline. And from what we understand, Israel and Hamas through Egypt, the U.S. and Qatar, were talking way into the night to figure out how to get this done. And the U.S. is putting immense pressure on Israel to keep the talks going, while Egypt and Qatar are pressuring Hamas to do the same.
And Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in Israel today. His latest trip coming as intense negotiations are ongoing with the U.S. and Qatar to extend that truce. Blinken's visit comes as 3 people were killed and 6 wounded in a shooting at the entrance to Jerusalem. Israeli police say 2 Palestinian gunmen opened fire at people at the bus stop, killing 2 women and 1 man.
We're reminded yet again by the events in Jerusalem today of the threat from terrorism that Israel and Israelis face every single day.
Blinken made those comments during a one-on-one meeting with Israeli President Isaac Herzog in Tel Aviv. Embattled Congressman George Santos blasting a number of people in the federal government as he's facing possible expulsion from Congress. He also announced he's introducing a resolution to expel New York Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman, who took a plea deal back in October after he pulled a fire alarm at the Capitol. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg News with this Bloomberg Business Flash. S&P 500, little changed after the November to Remember rally, has the index about 5 percentage points away from its record close. We did have data this morning bolstering bets, the Federal Reserve done with its hiking cycle. But oddly enough, I can't explain this one. Yields are higher. The 2-year, which is more policy reactive, up 4 basis points at 469. The 10 is up 6 basis points. Right now, that's at 432. Lena Komaleva, G Plus Economics, looking at what she calls immaculate disinflation.
The markets have declared victory for team inflation transitory. After 2 years of accelerating inflation, we're now having inflation fall as quickly as it rose last year. That is very encouraging.
AbbVie is going to acquire all outstanding shares of Immunogen for $31.26 a share in cash. Those shares up 81% as a result of that. S&P 500, 5 points lower. That's down 0.1% at 45.44. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, that's up right now 296 points higher. That's up 0.8%. NASDAQ 100, 128 points lower, and that is down 0.8%. And commodities, NYMEX crude, down 2.9% right now, 75.64 a barrel. The more international benchmark Brent crude, that's down 31 cents, 82.79 a barrel. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. Happy 11/30 day.
Very good.
Molly and Paul.
Thank you very much, John
Didn't get
Tucker.
you anything on this day.
No, you did not.
I think the fireworks of that moment were
Yeah,
probably
people
what
missed
caused
it.
my monitor to crash.
Yes.
We were just
Good.
so
Yep.
excited. That is 11:30 at 11:30 a.m. on 11:30 a.m. radio.
It's just amazing.
It just
how it all
it's
comes
like
together.
Y2K right here on this monitor. Just poof.
Y2K. Going back.
Remember, you weren't even born then. What are you
Yes,
talking
I
about?
was.
John Tucker.
Oh, please.
Thank you so much. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. All right, you look at the XBX, the S&P 500, up 18% year to date. Darn good year for the market, but not really. Back at the Magnificent Seven, maybe. You look at the S&P equal weighted index, up only 4% year to date. So that's maybe the 493 other names. Who knows how that all works? But there isn't a lot of breadth out there. And then the question is, how much of a concern is that for this market as we think about next year? Katerina Simonetti joins us. She's the Senior Vice President, Private Wealth Advisor at Morgan Stanley. Katerina, what are you telling your clients here as we look back a little bit on 2023, like how good a year was it? Because I guess it depends on what index you look at.
Well, Paul, Molly, thank you for having me on the show. Without doubt, this has been a confusing year for investors because when you look at the major market sectors, 7 out of 11 of them actually are down for the year. And there is some fantastic performance in certain parts of the market, specifically the indexes like S&P 500 that are driven by these top 7 stocks. And what differentiates these Magnificent Seven is that they performed well, not just on the whim, but because they showed the competitive market positioning, price efficiency, earnings growth, which is not something that the other companies were able to show this year, because for the most part, we saw the negative earnings revision. But this also has to remind to investors that are questioning all of the major concepts, that are questioning the diversification, the value of dividend investing, because the things that we know and believe to be quality and believe to be defensive type of positioning did not work as well as the major top stocks. But there is a rotation in market leadership, and we believe that, at the end of the day, diversification and the long-term outlook definitely work.
So, Katerina, part of the things that you talked about when you were giving us some of your talking points before the show, you're saying here that this challenging earnings dynamic is going to probably persist into early next year before what you call a sustainable earnings recovery takes hold. Tell us what that looks like and when we might expect it to happen.
Well, Molly, what has to happen for the market to turn? We need to have lower inflation. We need to have more accommodative monetary policy, consumer confidence that, will be a bit higher and better than, it is right now where, we're dealing with higher for longer narrative. But most importantly, we need to see this consistent earnings recovery. And it's going to happen. In our view, we should see the beginning of this towards the mid of 2024. And we think that that's about the same time, but most likely Fed is going to start cutting rates. At least that's our general expectation at the moment.
So how do you think about, or how do you advise your clients on kind of equities versus fixed income, and maybe even alternatives in a portfolio? What's the positioning for you guys these days?
Well, Paul, we look at dividend yields, we look at quality cash flows, we look at the diversified portfolios, and specifically the barbell between, for example, the consumer staples and industrials and energy, because there are sectors that have not performed quite as well as expected this year, but in our view are positioned to perform well, but also protect the portfolios from some of this heightened volatility that we expect to persist in early 2024. And we're looking at it, from the time horizon of not few months out, but few years out, and positioning portfolios for the future economic recovery, which sure is going to come. It's just, the timeline of the recovery, as always, is a bit foggy.
And so we're trying to think about next year, and, the big story, I think, is, obviously the Fed and how the cutting cycle is going to play out. So it looks like you said here that you think the first cut's going to come in the middle of next year. I mean, tell us then, when you hear some people who think that it could come as early as the first quarter, I mean, that to me just sounds like, man, it's only a couple months away.
Molly, we need to see significant economic slowdown. We need to see rise in unemployment. Fed needs to see some concrete data in order to be comfortable to start the rate cutting cycle. And they're not quite there yet, but this is not to say that it's not coming. We think that the writing's on the wall, that they probably are done raising rates. And then they're going to pivot for a while, because there's always a delayed action, delayed reaction to the Fed action, and we're going to see what's going to happen there. But inevitably, they're going to start cutting rates, and inevitably, we're going to see, the next phase, the next beginning of the next economic cycle. And what is unusual about this time, here and now, is that we can benefit from the higher interest rate environment. And that's what we're focusing our clients on. There's always icing on every cake, right? You tell them that, look, we might be dealing with this uncertainty in equity, but look at the environment where you can benefit from higher rates in cash, in fixed income. You can build well-diversified portfolios, not only on the equity side, but on the income side as well. And Paul, to your point, there are some remarkable opportunities in alternative investments, not only from the income perspective, but also from some of the distressed asset classes that are priced unfavorably, because of the current environment, but are positioned to do very well, in our view.
Katerina, on the equity side, what are some of the sectors that you're recommending your clients pay attention to?
Well, we focus on financials, utilities, energy. We like consumer for consumer discretionary. Healthcare, for example, is well positioned because in our view, it has both qualities of both defensive, but at the same time growth. We think there's always something that is positioned competitively, specifically because of the cash flows and the pricing, but also this higher operational efficiency that's going to come from the utilization of AI. There was so much excitement about AI earlier in the year, and it's going to inevitably translate into higher earnings, at least, in many sectors of the market, like financials.
Katerina, thanks so much for joining us. As always, Katerina Simonetti, Senior Vice President, Private Wealth Advisor at Morgan Stanley. All right, you're our tennis guru. Give me 30 seconds on pickleball.
Oh, boy. I personally am in the camp that I welcome it. I think it makes it more accessible for a lot of people and for a lot of my friends who say to me, I'd love to play tennis with you. And I'm like, I don't really want to play tennis with you.
Because you're not good enough?
Exactly. Look, it's just not fun for anybody. But I think pickleball, great narrowing of the gap there and, can make a more fun experience for everybody.
But how about if they ask you to give up a tennis court and make it a pickleball court?
That's where I draw the line.
Good because that's happening.
Yeah, and speaking of, literally they are drawing the lines on the tennis courts. It's very distracting.
I know, I understand.
I can't get with that.
Exactly, but it's the thing. I haven't played it. I think I need to get out there and play it, but it is all the rage. And I just wondered how the tennis folks kind of feel about it. Is it kind of impinging upon their territory? We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got it, Paul. A proxy fight. It could be set for Disney's annual meeting next year. Billionaire Nelson Peltz's Trian Fund Management. It's looking for a seat on Disney's board after its request was rejected. And Trian now holds about $3 billion of Disney stock. And in its statement, it said it will take its case for change directly to shareholders. Now, yesterday, Disney appointed 2 new directors, Morgan Stanley chief James Gorman and former Sky executive Jeremy Darroch. Meanwhile, Disney CEO Bob Iger is doing an about-face when it comes to selling off its cable channels. Bloomberg's Steve Potisk has that story.
It looks like the ABC TV network, FX, and other traditional TV channels are no longer being shopped around by Disney. CEO Bob Iger has had second thoughts about a possible sale, reversing comments from earlier this year that they are no longer core to the company. But now the view is networks like ABC and the Hulu streaming service can work together to create a wider audience.
Disney shares right now, they are down a fraction. On the pharmaceutical front, AbbVie agreed to acquire ImmunoGen for a total equity value of $10.1 billion. Now, the move delivers the biotech company's Elahere cancer drug to the pharmaceutical giant. Right now, we have AbbVie. They're up about 2%, but ImmunoGen up 82% right now. And Novo Nordisk putting the kibosh on imitators of its popular diabetes and diet drugs Ozempic and Wegovy. Medical spas, weight loss clinics, pharmacies, they've been selling knockoff versions, and the company continues to fight back. Novo is suing 2 more businesses, bringing the total number of U.S. lawsuits to an even dozen. Shares right now are down a fraction. Those are the company stories we're following. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio looking at these markets. S&P down about 0.1%. The Dow up 0.8%. Salesforce.com really pushing that index higher. It's got a big move today, up about 6%. NASDAQ off about 0.75%. Yields moving higher here. The 10-year Treasury is up 6 basis points, 4.32%. WTI crude oil, despite the fact that OPEC Plus is saying they're going to cut production by another 1 million barrels per day, it's off 3.5%, just above $75 per barrel. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Paul. A New York appeals court has reinstated a series of gag orders, barring Donald Trump and his lawyers from publicly commenting about the employees of the judge overseeing the state's civil fraud trial against the former president. Trump's motion to temporarily block those orders was denied without explanation. Indicted New York Representative George Santos faces expulsion from Congress. Earlier, he launched into a litany of innuendo about wrongdoing by other lawmakers, noting that he has yet to be convicted of anything.
So if I am to get expelled tomorrow, I will be number 6 in the history, the first Republican and the only one without a conviction or without being part of or without having committed treason.
Santos also suggested he may return to public service someday. This new effort to expel Santos from the House was precipitated by a damning ethics report outlining a pattern of campaign lies, alleged theft, and refusal to cooperate with investigators. He also faces a 23-count criminal indictment, including charges of wire fraud and identity theft. The World Meteorological Organization has declared 2023 the warmest year ever recorded, and the year's not even over yet. Researchers say global temperatures were around 1.4 degrees Celsius or 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the pre-industrial average for the first 10 months of this year. And Shane McGowan, the singer-songwriter who fused Irish music with punk rock and frontman of the Pogues, best known for the Christmas ballad Fairy Tale of New York, has died. His family said in a statement that the singer died peacefully early this morning with his family by his side. The musician had been hospitalized in Dublin for several months after being diagnosed with viral encephalitis late last year. He was just discharged last week ahead of his upcoming birthday on Christmas Day. Shane McGowan was 65 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Molly.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Molly, we're just talking about pickleball, and our good friends over at CNBC, they actually have a story out there. Pickleball's rapid growth may be coming back down to reality. Major League Pickleball, which I didn't know there was a thing, is requesting that players consent to compensation reductions of 40% in return for a reduction in work obligations. It's according to an email sent to players that was obtained by CNBC. The league's proposal asks players to reduce their number of annual workdays from 200 to 120, and it indicates it would cut their salaries proportionally.
I mean, that's massive to be, like, quote, working, less than nearly half the amount that you're working right now. But I got to say, bringing the economy into this, as we always try to do here at Bloomberg, if I'm Jay Powell and seeing that Major League Pickleball is going to be cutting salaries by 40%, I mean, that is
disinflation.
That is great. We need to see slower wage growth to get lower inflation. So I got to think, if he's looking at this today, this is green on the screen for him.
Potential M&A in the pickleball space. It comes as professional pickleball has seen rapid growth in nearly every category, and as Major League Pickleball and Professional Pickleball Association are on the cusp of signing an on-again, off-again, on-again merger agreement. As part of the pro sports whirlwind rise, the league offered huge contracts to lure players to their respective leagues. Did you get a huge contract offer?
I did not. I'm a little offended. Yeah. Obviously, they didn't get my email address. But how about you in the amateur league? You playing much these days?
No, I have not played, although it is taken over, or not taken over, but it is definitely has a big presence in the tennis facility of my club. So it's pickleball. They got leagues. It's all over the place.
Everywhere. Explosive, as they say.
And, it's easier to play, and a lot of folks can get out there and do it. So
can attest to that.
Yeah, why not? S&P 500 off 0.2%. The NASDAQ off 0.8%. The Dow Jones Industrials up 0.8%. So no direction in the markets. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to talk commercial real estate. Is it time to buy commercial real estate in the United States? We're going to have a good discussion on that with some smart voices. C-suite conversation, Subha Tatavarti, Chief Technology Officer at Wipro, will discuss AI development and the outlook for the space amid recent chaos at OpenAI. So we got some tech, we got some real estate, a lot of good discussions with some smart folks coming up in this hour. Speaking of smart people, let's kick this whole thing off with Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. Thank you, Molly. We have got stocks trading mix. Do want to begin with crude oil as Saudi Arabia extends a voluntary oil cut of 1 million barrels a day to the end of the first quarter of 2024. Again, a headline that we brought you moments ago, but worth repeating here. Saudi Arabia extending voluntary oil cuts of up to 1 million barrels a day. West Texas Intermediate crude down 3% right now, 75.52 a barrel on WTI. Equities are trading mixed right now. We have got a solid advance for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, up 288 points now. That is a gain of 0.8%. However, the S&P is down 8, just about worst level of the day right now, down 0.2%. NASDAQ lower by 116 points, drop there of 0.8%. And we cannot ignore small caps with the Russell 2000 up again today, up by about 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.31% with the 2-year right now 4.69%. Spot gold down $3 the ounce to 2,040. That is a drop of just about 0.2%. Crude, worth repeating, West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.9%, 75.62 a barrel. We are just hours away from Tesla's big event, 3 p.m. Wall Street time. CEO Elon Musk will be delivering the first vehicles at Tesla's Austin headquarters as part of a live stream launch. Dan Ives is a senior analyst at Wedbush Securities, and he was the guest this morning on Bloomberg Markets.
This is important. I call it a historical event for Tesla and Musk in terms of this new category, 4 years in the making. I mean, you got 2 million reservations. Even if 40% of those convert based on our estimates, 800,000. I mean, this is going to be a new growth vehicle, obviously on the edge, the Mad Max design, but I think this is going to be successful.
And we do have Tesla shares ahead of the turnover of the Cybertruck. We've got Tesla down 1.8%. By the way, the company is expected to provide key details, including price. Briefly, Ford has restored financial guidance, saying profits will come in lower than earlier projections because of rising labor costs. We've got Ford down now by 2.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. We're also on the in the car thing, the dashboard, Apple Play and Android.
CarPlay.
Yeah, all that kind of cool stuff.
All the things.
We're everywhere, so you can just find us pretty much everywhere. All right, let's talk about these markets, because as Charlie was just reporting, their indexes are all over the place. No direction. I have no idea what's going on out there. So let's bring in somebody who does. Abigail Doolittle joins us here. She covers all the markets for Bloomberg News. Abigail, what are you looking at here?
I'm looking at this little bit of a rollover of a whimper that we're seeing on this last day, trading day of November. It's, of course, been, everybody's been talking about in November to remember the best day for the S&P, or best month for the S&P 500 since July of 2022. For the stocks, chips, the best day month of the year, Russell 2000 and NASDAQ, the best month since January. But right now we have the NASDAQ down 0.8%, the worst day in almost a month or so. We have the Russell 2000 hanging on to a small gain. You know, I was just using the move function in the Bloomberg terminal on the S&P 500. The worst point drag for the S&P 500, interestingly enough, is NVIDIA. I'm not sure what the news is there. I'll be looking at that in a moment. But I, of course, first go to the chart. This stock is rolling over. And the reason that that could be of a concern, the month of November, if we had the conversation about whether or not, what's ahead for the month ahead, if we had that a month ago, the sentiment was very different. There was a completely different narrative. The world was falling off of a cliff. Now stock longs can't get enough of stocks. And the question is, what's ahead for December? When I look at the chart of NVIDIA, it's up, down, up, down, up, down on a monthly basis, going all the way back to basically July. Right now, it appears technically that it's going back down, which could suggest that December maybe is going to be a tough month. When you have ranges like this, it signals uncertainty that nobody really knows. Neither the bulls nor the bears have enough information to make a directional move up and out of the range or back below it.
Seems like we got enough information, at least on Salesforce today. That one's ripping.
Yeah, it's a good quarter that they put up. They beat profits by 19%. They put up $1.37 in adjusted earnings. But something that I would point out, they also did up the profit outlook. This has everything to do with cost cutting. Revenues, they beat barely by even 1%. They laid people off in August. That followed a 10% staff reduction earlier in this year. So it looks like strength on the surface, and the stock is responding well. It's up 7%, the best day, I think, since June of 2022. It might even be before that, but somewhere thereabouts. But again, it's from the profit standpoint, and also is a low bar quarter. So I don't know. I don't make too much of it. Plus, that stock's still down about 20% from its 2021 peak.
So NVIDIA, I'm just looking at the chart since you mentioned it here.
Yeah,
I mean,
it looks kind of ugly.
The 50-day moving average. I mean,
yeah, it's pretty close.
Yes, it's pretty close.
I haven't looked at this chart in a few weeks. The only reason I pulled it up is it's the worst mover on the S&P 500, down 3%. I have no idea why, but it is one of the barometers for risk on or risk off sentiment. And I would say right now it's such a barometer. I mean, this stock is it's crazy town. It's up more than 200% on the year. Yes, they have phenomenal growth, but at some point the kind of guidance raises that they do are going to peter out. So yeah, again, I just think that NVIDIA and the tone of today may be setting a little bit of the tone for December. Something to keep in mind, the dollar. Right now we have the Bloomberg Dollar Index off of its highs, up 0.3%, but it's had a rough November. Technically, it looks like it may bounce. That could, by implication, suggest that we're going to see yields do what they're doing today, which is climb. That 2-year yield, I wouldn't be too surprised to see it back above 5% in short order, which, of course, yeah, which would take liquidity out of the system. What's interesting, though, the 10-year doesn't look quite the same. I could see the 10-year hanging out at current levels. I don't know how to reconcile that, or maybe the 10-year chart changes, or maybe the 2-year chart changes. But if yields and the dollar go higher, that's going to tighten liquidity for risk-on investors. And again, suggesting that December could be, best case scenario flat, worst case scenario one of the down months that we've had, similar to September and October.
Abigail, can you stick around and talk some real estate?
Would love to.
Awesome. Let's get to our next guest, commercial real estate. Let's talk to Scott Kelly, founder and CEO of Atos Capital Real Estate. He joins us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Scott, thanks and welcome to Bloomberg. Talk to us about commercial real estate. It is on everybody's mind, from anybody who thinks about real estate, commercial real estate, to invest in banks that have financed commercial real estate, to everybody else involved in the ecosystem. It is ugly out there. Is it time to dip your toe in there and start maybe buying some of these properties?
Well, I think it's uglier than even the headline news would tell you, because there's a confluence of events which has really never happened before. First of all, the level of commercial mortgage maturities over the next couple of years is extraordinary. It's like $1.5 trillion over the next couple of years. Second, it's a cyclical business, and whether it's a hard landing or a soft landing, it's a landing. We're not in a great part of the economic cycle. There are secular trends that are really powerful, whether it's work from home, shop from home, stay in an Airbnb, move out of big cities in the Northeast to the Sun Belt. I mean, there are powerful secular trends which are influencing the performance of different properties. And this interest rate spike has got an enormous impact on what's essentially a leveraged business, because you want to leverage out a lot of the return for the real estate to drive equities. And then I would say, lastly, the regulatory environment has changed. For a long time during COVID, it was sort of hands-off. Nobody foreclosed on anything. There was a lot of leeway given to borrowers, just because that was the economic reality of things. That's changing as well. So all those things put together.
I'm not going anywhere near this space. You're just painting an ugly picture.
Well, but there are going to be winners and losers, and I do think it creates, like every disaster, it creates great investment opportunities, and there are iconic buildings here in New York that are just going to be fine. They're not going to, you don't want to see them going through the roof, but they're going to be fine. And you look at what office owners, as an example, have done. We were over at the GM building a couple weeks ago. They put in the Savoy Club, which is really an amenity to tenants. If you go to One Vanderbilt, they've got terrific restaurants and a Centurion Club. I mean, all of a sudden, the owners, I think, of these iconic buildings are able to put things in to keep tenants. The disaster, I think, is going to be for the kind of B and C quality properties, which are going to have a very hard time retaining tenants. And
this is an A property, by the way. I don't care who's talking about
this. Is A+.
This is a great. Yes, this
where
is
we
one of the
sit
best.
right now would not be.
All right, HQ not going anywhere.
On the A-OK part of this scale.
So relative to those B and C properties, we had Igal Namdar, president of Namdar Realty, in not so long ago, and of course his firm, he's best known for being a big buyer of zombie malls and going in at the lowest price. He's sort of doing the same playbook here in New York relative to the office properties because of exactly what you're talking about. Now, he was willing to put a value on the non-trophy properties. And he said, so if you go to a random building out here on 3rd Avenue, depending whether it's in the middle of the block or a corner, he said that it could go anywhere for 25 cents on the dollar to 75 cents on the dollar as for where it was before. Does that sound extreme to you, or does that match up to what you're seeing as well?
No, it does not sound extreme to me at all. I would say 25 cents is more likely, because you have to understand what the property taxes that and the operating expenses, particularly of these buildings in New York. When rental rates drop, you can have buildings that can't make any money, and I think that's a realistic prospect for some of these really bad buildings. So the question is, how low is low? And
25 cents on the dollar is low.
25 cents on the dollar is low.
So, something I've talked about a lot on this show here, Scott, is that I've been on this journey to buy an apartment in New York. It's provided for great newsworthy content for the show, as well as some stress in my own personal life. But something that has come up in this latest apartment that I'm looking at is that the commercial properties that are on the street level are right now perhaps not renewing the leases. And what that means then for the residential building above that owns this whole building and the income that they rely upon from these commercial tenants. So is that something that you're seeing as well, that like this distress in the commercial sector perhaps could have bigger implications for the residential side, which of course has a number of problems of its own right now?
Right. Well, yes, and I think the issue is the whole ecosystem has to work, right? If there aren't people in the office buildings, the guys selling sandwiches on the first floor are going out of business. If the tenants aren't in residential, buildings, it's very difficult for the ground floor tenants to be a dry cleaner, be a whatever that services the tenants. I think the big issue that people don't talk enough about, which has to be confronted, is it's going to take a long time to work this out, and it's got to be a cooperation between government and the property owners, and because people are going to need a break on property taxes, on zoning regulations and all that sort of thing. And unfortunately, good public policy, which would say get these buildings up and running, tend to be bad politics, because you're kind of giving money to people that are viewed as being wealthy and don't need it. That's not the case. I mean, the cities, I think in New York's one example, but I think you can talk about it in San Francisco and Chicago and anyplace else. If you don't have a vibrant real estate market, the tax base is just going to erode in the cities. And so it's going to take a thoughtful public policy approach to moving some of this office space to residential and other things, and that's New York's big problem, right? It's there's way too much office and there's too little residential, and so it's incredibly expensive.
Got to rezone it.
Well, and rezone, yeah, you've got to rezone it. You've got to give incentives to make those changes, and frankly, a lot of those kind of 70s style office buildings are not, particularly able to be, renovated into residential. We did company that we're partnered with for our domestic effort here, did a redevelopment of an office building in Washington into residential, and it's worked out beautifully. But those opportunities it takes a lot of expertise and a lot of help with the government and patience to get it done.
So switching gears just a little bit, Scott, we've been talking to you about this epic opportunity in distressed office here in the U.S., but your real wheelhouse over the last 20 years, although I should add you were one of the big MDs at Morgan Stanley back in the day, so your wheelhouse is real estate, period. You have just such a broad base of knowledge. But you've done a tremendous amount of investing in China and in Asia. You were in China, I believe, back in September, and you told me privately that it's worse, similar to what you're saying about the U.S., that it's worse than what's being reported. So talk to us a little bit about China. And does that seep into the global economy? Does that seep into the U.S.? And when do we hear those headlines more so again?
Well, I think you're starting to see them now. I mean, the Chinese property companies, and again, we run a series of private equity funds. Most of our investing in Asia. We've been at it for 22 years. Most has been in Japan, but we did put $600 million of equity into China in a variety of basically joint ventures, residential joint ventures to build condominiums to sell. And we all remember the lines around the block of people wanting to buy these things. There are no lines there today. But the issue with these, this capitalism stuff's a little bit tricky, right? and these Chinese property companies have gotten themselves run aground with terrible capital structures. And when I say that, they've got like 5 different branches of creditors. First are people that were buying condominiums that weren't delivered. Second were the construction lenders. When that dried up, they then borrowed money from sort of private funds that were raised in China. Then they went public in Hong Kong, and then they did high yield, bonds in Hong Kong. So, I mean, it's a big, big problem, and the Chinese government can fix it. It's going to take a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of expertise. There's no Hank Paulson over there to say, give me a bazooka. I don't necessarily need to use it.
But Xi has pretty much indicated that he's not willing, or he's not interested in saving. So what would force his hand in terms of putting that money into the market?
I think it's a guns and butter issue. There's only so much money. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with it? And I think civil unrest is the thing that they're really worried about.
And we've seen some pictures of that.
Yeah. Hey, Scott, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming into our studio. Scott Kelly, founder and CEO of Atos Capital Real Estate. Historically, has been investing, as Scott mentioned, in Asia, mostly Japan, but also maybe take a look here at the U.S. And to me, it's the lipstick building on 3rd Avenue. When I see something like that trade, I can't wait to see what the valuation is. It could be a big, big haircut. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now. Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Shares of Ford, they are lower right now. They're down nearly 3%. And this is after the automaker restored its financial guidance for the year. Now, Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta says that's not exactly good news.
Feels like the reinstating of guidance provides some clarity to the investor audience. Basically, they're saying that the profits are going to come in lower than they earlier projected, all of it tied to the labor cost from the new UAW contract that has been set in. But the numbers here are now, the range goes from $10 billion to about $10.5 billion. That is down, by the way, from about $11 to $12 billion before they had to suspend their guidance.
Now, Kriti mentioned the labor costs from its new contract with the UAW. Ford says those costs will rise by $8.8 billion over the nearly 5-year contract. But Ford CFO John Lawler told Bloomberg earlier he's hoping to limit passing the buck on to the consumer.
You have to think about pricing differently in our industry because all segments aren't the same. There's different pricing power across the segments. That's why we feel that what we did in segmenting the business and having the transparency around that is important. If you look at the commercial business in Pro, we believe there's still pent-up demand and pricing power there. However, in Blue, in the more of the retail consumer segment, you're going to see prices come down.
Now, since we're on the topic of prices, let's move on to Tesla, who will finally unveil the sticker price of its Cybertruck. Now, after 2 years of delays and production snags, Elon Musk will deliver that first vehicle at the company's Austin headquarters in just under 2 hours. Now, Tesla also expected to reveal details about the truck's configurations and battery range. Tesla is down about 1.5%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. S&P 500 rally hits a wall at the end of a historic month. We do have the S&P trading lower today by 10 points, down now by about 0.2%. The S&P at 45.39. The Dow up 227 points, up 0.6%. Salesforce leading gains in the Dow. Right now we do have Salesforce after earnings up by about 6.3%. Dow Industrials up 227, up 0.6. NASDAQ down 110, drop there of 0.8%. 10-year yield 4.33% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.70%. Gold down $3 the ounce to $20.40. A decline for gold of 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude down $1.90 a barrel, 75.96 on WTI, a drop right now of 2.4%. What is the difference between Coke and Pepsi for job seekers? Coca-Cola offers the best career mobility out of nearly 400 big employers, according to a new 5-year analysis of 4.7 million workers. Rival PepsiCo came in 19th on that same list. The data come from the American Opportunity Index. That is a product of Harvard Business School, the Schultz Family Foundation, and Burning Glass Institute, a labor-focused nonprofit. So again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow higher by 0.6%. S&P down 10, drop there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Charlie Pellet with the Bloomberg Business Flash. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, along with a couple of buddies here today. We are also streaming live on YouTube, so maybe we'll catch a view of them. Subha Tatavardi joins us. She's the Chief Technology Officer of Wipro. Wipro is a publicly traded company, New York Stock Exchange. WIT is the ticker. $25.2 billion market cap. Stocks year to date up about 3.8%. So that's good news there. Subha, thanks so much for joining us here. Software company, artificial intelligence. Can you tell us kind of where your company fits in the tech stack? What do you guys do at Wipro?
So we are a technology services provider, and we serve 1,400 customers across 25 plus verticals across the globe. We are anywhere from managing cloud and infrastructure migrations to managing full cloud stack to application development to tech support to consulting and strategy consulting. So we are a full service firm. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about what we're doing on GenAI on this show with you.
Yeah, tell us about that. I think, this year it seemed like the biggest story in AI was ChatGPT, and now it's going on with OpenAI and Sam Altman, a bit of a different development there. But tell us as far as investment opportunities for AI, what we can expect to see in the new year.
The way I see GenAI impacting, it is going to impact every business and every vertical and every technology stack, and we know this already. What is interesting is the categories that are emerging. I would specifically put GenAI impact in 4 specific categories. The first one is the entire SDLC process from software development lifecycle. Internally, we have been experimenting with this technology for the last 10 months, and we see 25 to 30% productivity gains. From requirements to testing to everything in between. The second area which is emerging is around content generation. The idea that you're able to reduce how much time it takes to create content, generate content is quite fascinating. And that's where we see a significant improvement in productivity gains. The third area we see emerging is this entire RPA 2.0, the entire idea that in the past it was around automation, but now it is mostly the new avatar or the reinvention of business process optimizations through generative AI. And the last category, the way I see it, is right now most of us have experienced generative AI through large language models. but applying the same architecture to other modalities, other datas, structured data, which will then start to impact these various layers in stack that I just referred to, I think it becomes quite fascinating. These are kind of the four trends I'm seeing I'm seeing emerging. And the application of these four areas will be fascinating, and we'll see what plays out in the next year, which will be very interesting.
Subha, we've heard some numbers from various technologists about the spending associated on artificial intelligence, on AI across a whole range of industries. From your perspective, how much of that spending, that AI-specific spending, is new incremental tech spending, or are they simply maybe taking their spending from another period of their place in their tech budget?
See, most of our technologists, we don't get a lot of budget. When I say that because we are very much tied. Technology is tied to how business outcomes. It's top line growth and bottom line optimizations and growth for us. What we tend to do is star the RTB and create the headroom, so to speak, and invest in new areas and new technologies. The idea here is productivity gains. The idea here is, how can I run the business smarter, more efficiently, with better predictability, so that I can generate those business outcomes. And when I look at it from that lens, it is quite interesting, the question, because the question itself is an answer, right? I mean, you won't get it. You always have the same pie. You'll just have to divvy it up in a ways that will generate value for business.
When we're thinking about AI, this is obviously such a rapidly evolving space. I would love to hear, Subha, some of the biggest lessons and takeaways that you had from 2023 and how you're going to bring that into the new year.
Specifically around Gen AI, our biggest learning has been that, and it's been a good learning, which is experiment fast and move fast. This space is evolving rapidly. The number of technology startups that we are investing at Wipro, we have a venture arm, and we also do a significant amount of work with startups, because that is how we create this robust ecosystem that will then offer the right solutions for our customer problems. We were rapid, very rapid in terms of investments. We announced $1 billion investment for our firm in summer. And the idea here is, you invest fast, fail fast, learn from it. And what is fascinating to us is, because of our investments early on, patterns are beginning to emerge. We understand that middleware, as an example, in this space, is going to be an explosive opportunity in 24 and 25. It is a very evolving space. What kind of stack would emerge out of Gen AI? The middle tier middlewares it's going to be fascinating. There'll be new startups and new companies born out of it with rapid adoption. And those patterns have to be recognized early on. And the only way you can do that is by experimenting and failing fast and making sure that you're able to invest at the right time.
Subha, talk to us about the risk here associated with AI, whether it's just data security, privacy, all those issues. How do you guys think about that?
We are a very responsible company. In fact, the very first tenet when we announced this investment is a responsible AI framework. And I see this as two sides of a coin: responsible and innovation. I think it's going to be interesting in the next few months and years. And obviously, we all heard about what the U.S. government signed in terms of responsible AI framework and in terms of privacy and other implications. I think more regulations will emerge, but we specifically here, we're taking a proactive decision in terms of how we want to develop, adopt, and operationalize Gen AI-based applications. I think this is going to be more regulated into the future, because it is anchored on data and privacy. For instance, what kind of data sets was the model trained on? What is watermarking? How does it manifest itself? How do you ensure that the output from generative AI, when watermarked, what are the commercial ways of monetizing, basically, how do you monetize? So all these patterns will begin to emerge in the next 3 to 6 months. And I feel that regulation is catching up. In this case, this is the first time I've seen regulation catching up somewhat faster than in the past in other technologies. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the industry then shifts to accommodate those regulations and policy changes.
So last one here, real quickly, Subha. So Wipro, really big company. You guys have got like 245,000 employees based out of India. Tell us what the AI adoption is like over there.
We are an AI-first company. We are bound to be AI-first company because we play in the technology space. You're right, 250,000 employees, primarily based out of India, but also worldwide. We are a global company. And the very first thing we ended up doing was to make sure that we build our own internal generative AI platform for various use cases. We are slated to have all our 250,000 employees on the platform in the next couple of months as we roll out various use cases. We're also, again, very anchored in generative AI training. So we are in the process of training all our 250,000 employees in generative AI and responsible AI. Yes.
All right, Subha, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Fascinating story there, fascinating discussion. Subha Tadavardi, Chief Technology Officer for Wipro. It is, this ticker's WIT, $25 billion US dollars market cap. So just an interesting player in the AI space. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Nancy Lyons, World and National News.
Thanks, Paul. Israel and Hamas have extended their ceasefire for another day, announcing their agreement just minutes before the previous extension had expired. Bloomberg's Lisa Fleischer has more on the ongoing negotiations.
From what we understand, Israel and Hamas through Egypt, the U.S. and Qatar, we're talking way into the night to figure out how to get this done. And the U.S. is putting immense pressure on Israel to keep the talks going, while Egypt and Qatar are pressuring Hamas to do the same.
Bloomberg's Lisa Fleischer. The talks to maintain the truce are ongoing. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel, where he says he's been speaking to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about the next phase of the war. He's also meeting with Palestinian Authority leaders in the West Bank. There is a battle underway on Capitol Hill. New York Congressman George Santos, who faces an expulsion vote in the House this week, is not choosing to go quietly. He says he plans to roll out his own expulsion resolution against another House member, Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman, who pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor for falsely pulling a fire alarm in a House office building ahead of a key vote.
I'm going to be introducing a privilege motion for expulsion of convicted and guilty pleaded Congressman Jamal Bowman.
Santos says he has yet to be convicted of anything, even though the House Ethics Committee did investigate him and released a report accusing him of campaign lies and theft. Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, has died at the age of 100. Historian Douglas Brinkley told CBS Mornings he'll long be remembered for his diplomacy with China.
It's Henry Kissinger who really orchestrated the biggest breakthrough imaginable, going to China with Nixon in 1972 and opening up relations between the two countries.
Chinese media says Kissinger was, quote, an old friend of the Chinese people. Global News, 24 hours a day. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow and the Russell 2000 both push higher. The S&P and NASDAQ are both in the red. Right now we have got the S&P 500 index trading lower on a mixed Thursday here. The S&P down by about 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 242 points, higher by 0.7%. Salesforce helping lead the Dow higher. Salesforce shares after earnings up 6.5%. S&P down 9, down 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 0.8%. Small caps move higher. Russell 2000 Index up by 0.1%. This month's blistering rally in stocks struggling to gain further traction. Traders giving a lukewarm response to data that bolstered bets the Fed is done with its hiking cycle. 10-year yield 4.32% with a 2-year at 4.71%. Spot gold down 0.2% right now to $20.40 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 1.6%, $76.57 a barrel. So what about the economic outlook and calls for a recession? Carl Riccadonna is chief economist at BNP Paribas, and he was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
When you push the Fed's funds rate up to 5.5%, the economy is slowing pretty swiftly based on the data we've been watching over the last couple of months, especially relative to that blistering Q3. We are definitely coming in for a landing of some sorts, and it may look smooth from 100 feet above the runway, but you don't know if it's going to be bumpy or not until you find out if the landing gear came out.
And you can hear more of the conversation with Carl Riccadonna on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. AbbVie has signed an agreement to acquire Immunogen for $10.1 billion in a move aimed at gaining access to some of the hottest new drugs in the cancer market. We've got AbbVie up by 2.2%, but look at shares of Immunogen. They are surging now by 82.4%. Recapping, stocks are mixed with the S&P down 7, drop there of 0.2%, the Dow up 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live as well on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. All right, how about this? The cost of conflict to the global economy this year is likely to be the highest since the end of World War II. Wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, and Africa have killed more than 100,000 people and disrupted the lives of many more. The post-Cold War peace dividend appears to be fading. With more on that is Gerard DePippo, senior geoeconomics analyst for Bloomberg Economics. Gerard, I didn't even think about it that way. I mean, but you guys are trying to put a price tag on, this global conflict we're seeing out there. What did your work kind of come up with?
Well, we undertook the dismal task of trying to quantify the economic cost of war, specifically by counting the number of battlefield deaths, which includes civilian and military, since 1946, and then essentially multiplying that, where those people died, essentially, or where they were from, by the per capita GDP of that country at that time. And what we found is if you do it that way, actually the total cost of battlefield deaths is the highest now since it's been since the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War.
So that's right. Is that taking into account the incomes that these people made and then the spending power, therefore, that they also represented?
Right. So, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of developing countries in over 60 years of history. And so what we used as a proxy for that was real per capita GDP during that time. I mean, in the real world, you would like to know specifically what their incomes would have been as individuals, demographics, et cetera, but that data is not available. But we were able to compile, basically reconcile databases to put together all the wars, essentially, since 1946 and separate those by country and region and calculate an estimate. And there's the chart right there.
Yeah, so just looking at, obviously back in the 80s, a lot of conflicts as well here. But, the longer term trends here are, they seem to be a little bit better. But, I mean, it just, when things spike like they do here at one time, it's the costs just kind of spike up as well.
Right. I mean, if you looked at defense expenditures, which we also showed over time, you would see that, generally speaking, defense expenditures as a share of GDP across countries has been declining for the past 50 years or so. But now we're seeing that bump up a little bit. You're seeing it maybe in Japan in response to China. You're seeing it in Europe in response to the Ukraine war. And so there's a question of, we lived through the peace dividend after the Cold War. Is this change that's happening now going to be enduring, or are we going to go back to something like the peace dividend after the conflicts in Israel with Hamas, or in Ukraine, or in Ethiopia and elsewhere, and that's an open question.
We're also seeing, to your point then, about defense spending rising in certain countries, in the U.S. as well, and that we just got the updated third quarter GDP report yesterday, and the initial estimate had shown that those defense expenditures were up a lot in that year through September. So tell us about the impact that this has been for the U.S. economy as well.
We did a separate research piece on the defense industrial base, and you're right. I mean, if you look at industrial production for defense goods, that's been surging essentially since the Ukraine war, so producing things like munitions, artillery, et cetera. In terms of the economy, it's still a fairly small share, and actually, historically it's had very little impact on inflation in the U.S., and we're still talking 3 to 4%, I guess, of overall U.S. GDP is going toward defense expenditures. But at scale, it can start to matter, particularly when other countries are now finally getting into the defense game. And Europe was essentially kind of neutral with defense for 20 or 30 years. Now they're back in it. Israel is maybe the glaring case of currently the greatest munitions usage and destruction, at least with Gaza. But there's other conflicts like the slow simmer, arguably stalemate in Ukraine, which is still not getting as much attention, but there's a lot of artillery and bombings going on there, and other smaller conflicts around the world.
So you also have some analysis here where you say the shift in the balance of economic power adds to geopolitical stress. What do you mean there? What did the data show you there?
Well, over time, I mean, the really big change over the past 40 years has been the rise of China, right? And so the Chinese, if you're talking about sort of emerging markets, the BRICS 11, but Chinese being most important, their expenditures as a share of GDP on defense are roughly constant, something like 2% of GDP, but the Chinese economy is growing a lot, right? And so if you looked at total defense expenditure, globally speaking, the share that is in the, say, emerging markets world and the China world is growing over the past 30 years as a share of overall defense expenditures, and that clearly has implications for U.S. national security.
And then when you're thinking of the countries where these wars are actually taking place, like in Ukraine and in Israel, obviously their economies are not doing so great, isn't that so?
I mean, Ukraine had something like a 30% GDP contraction when the war started. Israel, it's not quite as severe. They've essentially conscripted about 8% of the workforce. And our estimates are that the U.S., if the aid package comes through, might end up paying essentially like a third of the cost of the war. And Israel has very large reserves. So I think the fiscal and economic situation in Israel is far less dire than it is in Ukraine.
Gerard, I mean, you've been down in D.C. Most of your career at CIA, the National Intelligence Council. Do you think politicians, do you think folks like in CIA, for example, do you think they think about war in this economic context?
They certainly think about it in terms of economic resources, and there's a lot of emphasis on the actual military costs and what it takes in terms of inputs. I mean, in general, when you try to aggregate something like this, it's always dodgy. What you often care about is really what munitions are being used, how much is sort of true defense expenditure when you adjust for certain things across countries. But the idea of essentially trying to do order of battle analysis and balance of power analysis, that is central to a lot of what the intelligence community does.
All right, Gerard, thanks so much for joining us. Fascinating work by you and your team. Alexander Isakov, he's an economist at Bloomberg. Gerard DePippo, analyst, and Ziad Daoud, economist, all at Bloomberg Economics. Fascinating research, fascinating reporting here. Gerard DePippo, senior geoeconomics analyst, Bloomberg Economics, based down in Washington, D.C. The cost of war, you can put a dollar sign on it, I guess is kind of what they're showing here. Looking at the markets here, not much happening out there. Kind of a quiet day on the indexes.
Yeah, I think that we haven't really talked about this yet today, but it was really what I've been trying to reconcile is why on a day when you've got this report that inflation has eased and spending is still, chugging along but moderating, why we're seeing that stocks were down and yields were up.
Yeah, interesting. It's been, again, the November to remember. It's been such a move, maybe just taking a little bit of a pause here. But again, the economic data that came out here today kind of showing that the economy is gradually cooling. I mean, I think if you're at glass half full person, when you see the moderating inflation, but still decent economic growth, you're saying, boy, that looks like a soft landing.
I like to think so.
Yeah, that's kind of why I signed up. And maybe that's clearly what we saw in the performance in the month of November in the bond and equity markets. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got to fall. Shares of Salesforce, they are higher after cost-cutting measures helped the management software maker deliver better results. Bloomberg Abigail Doolittle says that the company is having its best day since March of this year.
It was mainly profits, adjusted earnings by 19%. They put up $1.38 in adjusted earnings. They also raised the profit range, the outlook. In August, they cut jobs. That followed a 10% staff reduction earlier this year. The goal was profitability. They achieved it, revenue beating, but just very slightly.
Salesforce up more than 6.5%. This week, Amazon's web services business has been rolling out a range of AI products. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti has more on its latest offering.
Now it's taken the wraps off a new AI tool that businesses can use to generate images called the Titan Image Generator. Amazon is the largest provider of rented computing power and data storage, but it's trailed Microsoft-backed OpenAI and Google in the hotly contested market for generative AI.
Amazon down just a fraction right now. While Elon Musk fights to get advertisers back on his X platform, Facebook parent Meta Platforms, well, it gets ready to launch Threads in Europe. Now, sources tell the Wall Street Journal it could happen as soon as next month. Right now, Meta is down about 2%. And what's your favorite app? Apple unveiled the winners of its 2023 App Store Awards for those that promote creativity and new adventures. Well, topping the list is All Trails. It's an app for finding outdoor hiking trails, and as well as sketching digital makeup app, Preta Makeup, and editing photo app, Photomator. Apple shares right now, they are down just a fraction. Those are the company stories we're following. I'm Lisa Mateo.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets here, the S&P 500 off 0.1%, Dow up 0.7%, NASDAQ off 0.6%. So you go figure out what's going on out there. I do know that yields are higher. 10-year Treasury is up about 8 basis points, 4.34%. That's the high of the day, to mention that. WTI crude oil off 1.3%, despite the fact that Saudis are in the OPEC Plus said they're going to cut production by up to another 1 million barrels per day. That's $76.72 on WTI crude. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We're going to get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is doing some shuttle diplomacy today, first going to Israel to meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and then going to the West Bank to talk with leaders of the Palestinian Authority. It is Blinken's third trip to the region since the war began. Earlier today, there was an extension of the pause in fighting. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern has more on that angle.
It's clear from what the U.S. is saying, behind the scenes and also in the open, that they would like to see a prolonged pause to make sure they can get all these hostages out. As on top of that, they want to see more humanitarian aid going into Gaza.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reporting from Washington. Well, the man who invented the term shuttle diplomacy, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, has died. He used that term as he went back and forth in the Middle East and the 1973 Arab-Israeli conflict. Kissinger was 100. He will be remembered for helping open up the relationship between the U.S. and China, but he's also criticized by some scholars for his bombing campaign that they say killed hundreds of thousands of Cambodians. The odds of a government shutdown in the new year may be easing a bit, and as Bloomberg government's Jack Fitzpatrick reports, ultra-conservatives in the House are backing off some of their demands for deep spending cuts.
The Freedom Caucus and the hardline conservative wing was pushing for about $120 billion in cuts below the level outlined in the summer's debt limit deal, which was supposed to be a bipartisan agreement on how much they were going to spend. The chair of the Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry, just said yesterday they realize those additional cuts are not going to happen.
Jack Fitzpatrick covers Congress for Bloomberg Government in Washington. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Paul and Molly.
All right, Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Molly Smith, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Are you a coffee drinker, Molly?
I'm not part of the culture.
Well,
tell me about it.
Occasionally I will go to Starbucks, and I like to do the mobile order. And occasionally you put the mobile order in, and you'll get, we're not accepting mobile orders at this time, but feel free to come into the store. And apparently, we might see more of that. Starbucks is making it easier for employees to pause mobile orders in response to staffing concerns, an issue that's contributed to repeated protests by unionized baristas. So there you go. I mean, this staffing issue is a thing, and everybody's doing mobile orders. And I think sometimes when they don't have enough staff, they just get overwhelmed.
It always comes back to the economy on a segment that we're doing here, whether it's tennis or pickleball, and this one as well. The labor shortages, it's a real thing. But Starbucks spokesperson Andrew Terrell did say that this functionality is unrelated to the union, was initiated months prior to the strike. So they see this more as a technological enhancement rather than a policy change. So just to clear that up from Starbucks.
Joe Matthew darkened the door here because he's doing his show live in New York. What brings you to the big town?
That was like a cool coffee reference.
Yes.
Yeah. It's funny you're talking about that because one of the greatest things I read this morning is there's a MAGA mart that has been put up as public square is what it's called, that Don Jr. and his fiance are running to raise money for Donald Trump. And you can buy coffee made by the Covfefe company.
Really?
Do you remember Covfefe?
Yes.
Covfefe, the crazy. You can actually. That's a real thing now. What does that say about our culture? That became a real thing, and people are spending money on it.
That became a real. Tell me you're not talking about that on Sound On.
That's where our lead story today is Covfefe. And as someone who has a kid who works at Starbucks, where by the way there is no union around there.
Nope.
I have to admit, Dad loves getting the free coffee.
Sure.
That's like the best part of it.
Very good. We'll add that.
Probably shouldn't have said that on the air.
S&P 500 down 0.1%. The Dow up 0.7%. NASDAQ off 0.6%. So no real direction in these markets. All right. As we promised you or threatened you, Sound On with Joe Matthew from New York City starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The truce between Israel and Hamas has come down to minute-by-minute negotiations. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As talks over freeing more hostages become more difficult, and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, calling on Tel Aviv to comply with international law when the fighting resumes, and it will. It's just a question of when. We're joined this hour by a voice of experience. The former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, is with us on the fragile truce and what happens when it's over. Conservative Republicans in the House do an about-face on spending cuts, and George Santos goes for broke on what appears to be his last full day on the job. We'll talk about all these stories with our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are with us for the hour. We do it all after Wall Street, of course. Let's update the markets right now with our friend Charlie Pellet here in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hello there, Joe Matthew. I thank you very much. The Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ, they are both declining. This month's blistering rally for stocks struggling to gain further traction. Traders giving a lukewarm response to this morning's data that bolstered bets that the Fed is done with hiking rates. We begin with the 10-year, and the yield there, 4.34%. The 2 years yielding, 4.71%. Stocks are trading mixed. Dow Industrial is up 250 right now. That is a gain of 0.7%. We got Salesforce after earnings doing the heavy lifting there. Salesforce shares, they're up now by 6.5%. S&P, though, in the red, down 7 points, drop there of 0.2%. NASDAQ lower by 98 points now, a decline of 0.7%. Spot gold down $6 the ounce to $2,038, a drop of just about 0.3%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is at $76.50 a barrel, down now by 1.8%. Neil Dudd is head of U.S. Economic Research at Renaissance Macro Research, and on surveillance this morning, he told us he does see rate cuts coming in the first quarter.
I do think that the data is lining up, and we're on a glide path now to a rate cut probably by March, frankly. If you look at core PCE inflation, since June, it's up just 2.3% at an annual rate, and there's a lot of disinflation in the pipeline.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. AbbVie has agreed to acquire Immunogen for $10.1 billion in a move aimed at gaining access to some of the hottest new drugs in the cancer market. Shares of AbbVie, they're up 2.4%. Immunogen surging 82.2%. And briefly, MicroStrategy chairman and co-founder Michael Saylor has placed one of his biggest bets yet with the enterprise software maker turned Bitcoin investment fund Proxy, buying $593 million more of the largest cryptocurrency. MicroStrategy down 1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you, and welcome to the Thursday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew at Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York as we begin with an eye on Israel today. There are serious questions right now about whether the truce between Israel and Hamas will be able to continue. A lot's changed since this time yesterday. After negotiators chose to extend the pause, they did get it done late last night by just one more day. That's what we're in now, day 7. The latest extension did not come easily, with confusion over hostages, lists of names from Hamas, choppy communications between the two sides, and it's leading some to believe that this, in fact, may be it. There are also serious questions about what comes next. That's why Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in Tel Aviv now. Talking earlier with Benjamin Netanyahu about the next phase of this war, he says, of course, we all know that fighting in Gaza will resume at some point, but of course, much has been accomplished over the course of this truce. Dozens of hostages released, humanitarian aid brought into Gaza. Antony Blinken talked about that earlier in Tel Aviv. Here he is.
From day one, we have been focused relentlessly on trying to secure the release of hostages from Gaza and from Hamas. And we have seen over the last week the very positive development of hostages coming home, being reunited with their families, and that should continue today. It's also enabled an increase in humanitarian assistance to go to innocent civilians in Gaza who need it desperately. So this process is producing results. It's important, and we hope that it can continue.
His third trip since October 7th, and that's where we start our conversation with William Cohen. The former Secretary of Defense is with us, of course, now Chairman, CEO of the Cohen Group. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you, and I appreciate your being with us here at this critical time. Do you think the truce ends today?
Well, I think they're going to extend it perhaps one more day, but this cannot go on indefinitely. The goal of the Israelis, obviously, is to get as many, if not all, of the hostages out before they resume military action. But military action will be forthcoming. You cannot afford to have Hamas remain intact as far as its infrastructure and leadership is concerned. And the Israelis are not going to sit back and say, well, we got our hostages back, but we'll live with this kind of threat on our border for the indefinite future. So that's not going to happen. So I would expect after the Israelis conclude they've got as many out as they can for the time being, they're likely to start the bombing again. But they will do it on a less massive basis, a much more discreet, targeted basis, because they've seen the world reaction to when you have wholesale bombing and the killing of innocent civilians. That makes them not a victim anymore, but a villain in the eyes of all of those in the region and much of the world community. And so I think they'll take that into consideration, be much more targeted, much more direct, and minimize the loss of innocent civilians in the air.
Well, that's certainly the hope of this administration. Of course, Mr. Secretary, that's one thing that Antony Blinken is urging, but we know it's coming. Benjamin Netanyahu says there's no situation in which we do not go back to fighting until the end. That's a direct quote. Hamas continues to say October 7th was a dress rehearsal. What are the optics going to be when this resumes?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu has made it clear that he has to reduce, if not eliminate, the entire infrastructure, the military infrastructure of Hamas. He's not going to yield on that point. But you have the President Biden and Antony Blinken sending the signal behind the doors, so to speak, through emissaries, perhaps even our CIA chief, to say, be careful here, because you have an existential interest at risk here, but we have interests at risk in the greater region. We do not want to see this go further, because now our troops will be certainly in the firing line. We'll have some of the Islamic groups targeting our soldiers, whether in Syria, in the greater Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. So I think we have an interest in helping the Israelis defend themselves and take on Hamas. We also have an interest in making sure that the Israelis don't pursue their mission in a way that jeopardizes our interests in the region, as well as the greater stability between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. All of those countries have an interest in seeing this not spread. So that is why Secretary Blinken, that is why President Biden is urging some restraint on the part of Netanyahu.
Secretary Cohen, Israel believes 145 hostages are still being held in Gaza. Once fighting resumes, is hope lost?
It's not lost because the hostages were held before the attacks began by the Israelis. The Hamas didn't kill all of them. They knew what they always do and know. The more they hold out, the more concessions the Israelis and the West is going to insist upon before the hostages be released. So they're playing this very deadly game. It's really vicious, cynical. We'll let a few out, and then we'll see how much time we can buy in order to reposition our forces. We'll let a few more out, and we'll put the pressure on the Israelis to make more concessions. And that's the game they've always played, and the one they're playing right now, because the world opinion basically does not want to see people being killed. We're living in the age of information. You've got immediacy. You've got the intensity of it. You've got the polarization of public opinion. And then you have all of that coming down the Israelis saying, hey, back off. Yeah. You've made your point. You've killed enough of the Hamas fighters. So let's just go back to the way it was. And the Israelis are saying, no, we're not going back there. We're going to make sure that you're not going to ever do this to us again. So they're in it for the long haul. President Biden is saying, we're with you, but make sure you are much more discreet, much more concerned about killing innocent Palestinians. The more you kill, the more enemies you're making, the less public support you're going to have. You have us, maybe the Brits, but there isn't anybody else in the world that's going to be with you. So we have a voice here. Our voice is one of urging restraint to the extent we can. And I think that is what's taking place right now.
Fascinating. We were quick to move 2 carrier strike groups into the region following October 7th. We've talked about that. Of course, the Jerry Ford and the Ike, and they've decided to move in different paths. But we've surged resources into the region. Maybe we should take credit for the fact that that's why we don't have a second or third front. You mentioned that as well, open at this point. But going forward, you ran the Pentagon, sir. What should be our military posture when fighting resumes?
Our military posture has to remain the same. This is a signal to Hezbollah, it's a signal to Iran, to any who mean to see this thing spread, that we are there and we will respond. To the extent that you have the Houthis firing missiles at our ships, if you have any of the Iranian proxies firing and targeting our soldiers, there's going to be a response. And we'll have a major response and calibrate that depending upon what they're doing. So if they have a major attack upon us, I think all holes are off at that point. So it's a signal that we're there. We're there as a deterrent. We're there to defend our forces and to preserve the peace and stability to the extent it exists in the region. That's our mission. And could I just say one more word?
Yeah, please.
I can't let this pass without noting the passing of Henry Kissinger, who was a dear friend of mine, whom I've known for 50 years. And I think that he would be one who certainly made every effort to bring peace to the Middle East, but so has every other former Secretary of State. But he was special, and I think we won't see the likes of him ever again.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to ask you about him. There's so much talk of legacy. Obviously, this is an American icon, but it's also a controversial man. You're speaking affectionately about him. What would you tell people who criticize his activities, for instance, in Cambodia or Laos, and some people who would say that he violated international law?
Henry Kissinger was the man in the arena, as was Richard Nixon. And anyone who steps in that arena is going to get criticism as well as compliments. I knew Henry Kissinger on a personal level and saw a different side of him. He certainly was brilliant beyond measure. He certainly was concerned about order and peace. And there's a little paradox as you think about it. He would say, or paraphrase, he'll say, you can't have, if you have liberty, you have to have order. You can't have liberty without order. If you have liberty without order, you have a mess. If you have order without liberty, you've got a menace. And Kissinger was always trying to balance, how do we preserve freedom and balance that with having order? You cannot have one without the other, and I think that was his mission. And he made some very tough decisions, and yes, people died as a result of it, but most of us in the world is better off for Henry Kissinger having lived and given guidance to so many presidents over the years.
It's pretty remarkable to think he was sitting in Beijing with President Xi just weeks ago, Secretary. I don't know when the last time was you spoke with him, but what would he do right now with this situation in Israel?
I saw him most recently in April. There was a celebration of his 100th birthday at CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies. He was there with Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, and they were talking about AI. And once again, Henry was worried about artificial intelligence getting out of control, which would lead to an extinction level event. And that's what he's always been concerned about. His first book was Nuclear Power and Foreign Policy. That was the book he wrote back in 1969. And that's while he was professor at Harvard. Since that time, he's been writing about how do we maintain peace and order in an ever turbulent, spinning world, kaleidoscopic changes taking place. How do we preserve stability and order and freedom? That has been his life's mission. And it was right up until the time he died, because he was working with Eric Schmidt on another follow-up book on artificial intelligence.
That's incredible. Well, it's not lost on us, Secretary Cohen, that you
and he loved dogs,
and,
by the way.
President Clinton were the first to return to Vietnam after President Nixon visited. I know that your careers have overlapped in a lot of ways, and I'm glad that you could spend some time with us to talk about Henry Kissinger today, Secretary of Defense, formerly at the Pentagon. William Cohen, we thank you, sir, as always, for joining us today on Bloomberg. Come back and see us again soon. I'm Joe Matthew in New York as we assemble our panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. I didn't plan to go right into the Kissinger thing here. I'd like to talk to both of you more about what's happening in Israel. But Rick, you spent time with Henry Kissinger at a very similar event, unless it was the same one that Secretary Cohen just mentioned. He was talking about world affairs, geopolitics, and even meeting, as I mentioned, with President Xi at 100 years old. What was he like when you were with him last?
Yeah, I think he had the most vital 100th year of anybody's life. The McCain Institute that I chair hosted him for a very similar conversation with Eric Schmidt and the founder of Bloomberg News, Michael Bloomberg, to talk about AI. And I echo the comments that the secretary gave just now about Henry Kissinger's concerns about, where does AI lead us? It's not where it is today. He was a very strategic thinker. He always thought 5, 6, 7 steps along the way. And he was concerned that by the time you got there, you couldn't contain what could become a very dangerous computer capability. So I thought it was very pressing. He'd written a book along with Eric Schmidt called The Age of AI. And it was really his latest passion, much like the secretary said, his beginning was in nuclear power. His final work was about the future of electronic power. So, and he was totally conscious of world affairs. He spent a lot of time at our event in October talking about Israel and Hamas. It had just happened a week earlier, and the incursion from Hamas into Israel, and he had his own point of view on it. And you could tell that his great mind was still clued into current events, and it was quite an amazing evening.
I want to get Jeannie's view on this as well and get both of your takes on what's happening and is about to happen in Israel, in Gaza, as this story moves under our feet once again. Thanks for being with us. As always on the fastest show in politics, we've got a lot more with Rick and Jeannie as we just get wound up here on Sound On. And an about face on Capitol Hill. We'll talk about the funding battle as well. The Freedom Caucus is singing apparently a very different tune today. Maybe it prevents a government shutdown? That's next. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow higher, the S&P, NASDAQ, they are both lower. The S&P 500 rally hitting a wall at the end of a historic month. It is on to December tomorrow. We've got shares of Amcor Technology today. They are moving lower. It plans to build a $2 billion semiconductor advanced packaging facility in Arizona, an investment that could generate as many as 2,000 jobs and bolster the Phoenix region's status as an American chip-making hub. Stocks mixed. S&P right now down 7, down 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 279, up by about 0.8%. And NASDAQ is down 113 points right now, a drop of 0.8%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 141, a decline of 0.1%. Russell 2000, though, is advancing, up 0.3%, 1809 right now on the Russell 2000. 10-year yield 4.33%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.70%. Spot gold is down $6.50 the ounce to $20.37, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.3%, $76.81 for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. So again, recapping, we do have stocks mixed. The Dow higher by 0.8%, S&P lower by 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellett. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Secretary of State back in Tel Aviv today, his third trip there since the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. And it's about the next phase, because it does appear that this truce is about to end now a week long. It was extended by one more day last night. That's the day we're now in, as Israel waits to see what happens next. Of course, a lot of this is taking place through intermediaries, Qatar being one of them. Our CIA director is still there, and anything could happen. But at some point soon, it's likely, as we just discussed with the former Defense Secretary William Cohen, that the fighting is going to resume. The question is, what form will it take, and what will be the administration's posture at that point? We reassemble our panel with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, what's your thought on this? Are people too quick to call the end of this truce? There seemed like there was more optimism yesterday. Things got a little messy in talks last night. Are we going to see bombing in Gaza by the end of the day?
You know, I don't know about the end of the day. Hopefully not. Hopefully it extends this pause. But the reality is, and Secretary Cohen is absolutely right, we are going to see bombing in Gaza. The military action, rather, will resume. The question is not if, it's just when, unfortunately. We know that. And I think he made a really, really important point, one among many, which is that the amount of sway that the United States has and needs to exercise over Israel is dramatic. I mean, we saw that with the visit of the high-level military officials from the IDF to Congress the other day, and the fact that Blinken is there and so many of our public officials. The reality is we have a big voice there. We are very supportive, the number one supporter they have, but we need to be very clear about where we will draw some lines on what they can and cannot do as we go forward. And that's got to be based on what's in our own interest if we're using public money to support them, which most people, including myself, think we should be doing.
Rick, the rhetoric seems to speak for itself on both sides here. Secretary Cohen was expressing his belief, if not hope, I guess, that there'd be a more restrained approach going forward here. But the truce may not end well. It didn't feel great last night when it looked like it might not be extended. We heard from Benjamin Netanyahu, who says there is no situation in which we do not go back to fighting until the end. Some have wondered what exactly the end looks like here. We also know Hamas says October 7th was a dress rehearsal. Do you share his hope, or could this be full-bore fighting again in Gaza?
Yeah, look, I mean, we sometimes confuse phraseologies. This has been a ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to get into Gaza, but also to allow the work to be done to get the hostages out. There are still hostages there. There's still over, I think, 150 hostages, or around 150 hostages. So there's still over a dozen women, in the hands of the Hamas. So I know that is Israel's top priority. They've said so. They're talking about extending the truce another day, the ceasefire another day. But this is not a truce. This is not a negotiated settlement between parties that said we're going to lay down our arms and stop fighting. And so it should always have been expected, and should be expected, that Israel would continue their strategy, which is the dismantling and the eradication of Hamas. Hamas is an existential threat to Israel. They proved that when they incurred into Israel and slaughtered civilians. And there's no reason why Israel should not look at that and say, if we don't handle it today, it'll happen again in the future. It is the stated policy of Hamas to eradicate Israel. And so I think that it should not be expected until that tone changes that Israel should change its strategy.
Sounds like it could start ripping, like we were seeing just 7 days ago. But of course, we'll find out together. And if this is extended, we'll let you know. So much of the conversation this week, Rick and Jeannie, has been about funding for Israel, how that may hinge on a deal on border security. But there's been an amazing development here in the debate over government funding that appears to be good news. You know, we could start shutting down in 50 days now that we have this staggered or laddered CR. And the chair of the Freedom Caucus is backing off. Apparently the group is backing off its demands that we throw away the debt ceiling deal from months ago and cut top-level funding even below the levels that were already agreed to with the White House, with former Speaker Kevin McCarthy and others. Let's hear from the chair of the Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry. Here's how he put it.
It's still too much for many of us, but was agreed to around Memorial Day was this FRA number of $1.59 trillion. No more gimmicks. Most of the House voted for it. Most of the Senate voted for it. That's where we have to be. Don't be adding stuff onto it. Let's write the appropriations bills. Let's get the spending bills right. Let's set that as the number. And then when we do that, let's start conferencing bills. We're calling on our friends in the Senate. My colleagues here that are with us today already agree with this. We need Senate leadership to put these bills to conference. Let's get the process started where the American people know what's being spent, know how their members vote, and know what it's being spent on.
Okay, well, Kevin McCarthy must be rolling right now, Jeannie, because he got fired for putting that deal together and having Democrats vote on a CR to get us through all of this. And now it appears the Freedom Caucus feels differently. What is going on? And is a shutdown suddenly less likely?
Yeah, it was fascinating when he made this statement. So many reporters thought that they potentially had misheard him, that the congressman had made a mistake, and they're double checking. And no, he apparently meant what he said. The question is why? Have they taken off suddenly their rose-colored glasses and woken up to the fact that they do not control the Senate and they will get rolled by the Senate if they pursue this? Is this just as, potentially could be an attempt to humiliate Kevin McCarthy all over again? It's really, really tough to tell. I hope that it means that this is off the table, the idea that we would shut down again, but the reality is we can never tell, because given how tight the House is, it takes just one member of this caucus. And at the same time this news is breaking, you've got this piece in Politico where you have members of the Freedom Caucus describing the new speaker in some pretty negative terms, saying his performance has plummeted, that he has raised, their ire against him. So it's hard to tell if this is completely off the table and they're going to be working with some modicum of sanity, or if one member will potentially do what Matt Gaetz did just, a few weeks ago. And Joe, you mentioned 50 days. I think that's 50 days for all of us real folks. But in Congress, I think we're looking at more like 19 or something.
Yeah,
so
sure.
they're going to have to get moving on this really, really fast if they're going to get it done.
So what do you think happened here, Rick? We know Speaker Johnson met with Mitch McConnell, just 2 days ago? Did that lead to a couple of phone calls, brought Freedom Caucus to the table? Or do you think the Freedom Caucus is just worried that the Senate would add even more money to that top line?
Oh, I don't think they're worried about adding more money. They've got a number that in the Senate they're adhering to the 1.59 trillion number. Said so at the beginning and thought it was foolish for the House to try and renegotiate after agreeing to that number. So the Senate's pretty stable on that. I think this is just a reality of what Jeannie was just saying, which is they've got very few days to actually pass 7 or 8 appropriations bills. And then as the chairman of the Freedom Caucus said, Perry, he's like, and then we have to conference those with the Senate because the House appropriation bills are full of all kinds of strange policies that they know are going to get stripped out by the Senate. So the one thing nobody wants is a continuing resolution for the balance of fiscal year 2024. I mean, like, that's a nightmare for everybody. That means that all the money that was spent, appropriated and spent for 23 looks exactly like the budget for 24. Nobody wins. It's all losers. And so I do think that's probably where they are going is, my God, if we don't get these appropriations bills done, we're going to be stuck with a continuing resolution for the balance of the year, and that's a disaster.
I think that might be an actual rational thought. I'm actually encouraged by this. Who would have thought today with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano? I think I deserve a little credit. I have not mentioned George Santos yet. Don't tell me this is not a policy-driven show. But we're going there next. You should have seen the reporters this morning. At 8 a.m., 28 degrees in Washington, all bundled up, waiting for the gentleman from New York to emerge for his big news conference on what many believe will be, I know you've heard me say it before, his last full day in office. He's not going quietly. We'll have more on that next after we check world and national news. Nancy Lyons has that for us in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is among those paying tribute to Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, who died yesterday at the age of 100. Blinken speaking in Tel Aviv during his latest trip to the region since the war began.
Few people were better students of history. Even fewer people did more to shape history than Henry Kissinger.
Blinken says he was privileged to receive Kissinger's counsel many times. Former President Trump is once again under a gag order in his civil fraud trial. A New York appeals court has reinstated the order that bars Trump from commenting about court personnel. The order was imposed after he disparaged a law clerk in the trial. The decision from a 4-judge panel came 2 weeks after an individual appellate judge had put the order on hold while the appeals process played out. Well, there's another sign that inheriting money is becoming an ever larger factor in the distribution of wealth.
UBS Group says heirs joining the ranks of the world's richest over the past year racked up more wealth than newly minted self-made billionaires. Of the 137 people who became billionaires last year, 53 inherited fortunes amounting to a combined $151 billion. While self-made billionaires outnumbered them, the 84 individuals who joined the list had accumulated just $141 billion. That was the first time since UBS started compiling the report 9 years ago that new billionaires inherited more wealth than they created. Karen Moscow, Bloomberg Radio.
It's red versus blue when Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis and California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom go head-to-head tonight during a 90-minute debate. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 rally hitting a wall. Final trading day of November. We've got the S&P down 7 points right now at 45.43. A drop of just about 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average now up 284 points, up by about 0.8%. Salesforce helping lift the Dow higher. Salesforce after earnings advancing by more than 6%. We do have the S&P 500 index, though, in the red. S&P down 7 now, drop there of 0.2%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 112 points, a decline of 0.8%. The Nasdaq 100 Index down 0.9%. Russell 2000, though, green on the screen, advancing by 0.3%. 10-year yield 4.33%. 2-year yield 4.70%. Gold at $2,036 the ounce, down 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.2%, 76.16 for a barrel of WTI. Among the economic reports out this morning, we did have consumer spending slowing last month, also jobless claims numbers. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The total number of people on unemployment rolls rose to the highest in 2 years, 1.9 million in mid-November. That suggests out-of-work Americans are finding it more difficult to secure new jobs. New jobless claims are also up. The unemployment rate is on the rise, reaching 3.9% in October, the highest since January 2022. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
OPEC Plus has agreed to deepen its production cuts following a slump in crude prices and predictions of a renewed surplus next year. Again, we've got crude oil trading lower by 2.3%. Among some of the oil majors, ExxonMobil shares little changed right now, down just 2 cents. BP up 0.6%. Chevron down 0.8%. Recapping stocks mixed. S&P down 7, down 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
You didn't think George Santos was going to go that easily, did you? The 8 a.m. news conference actually took place this morning. I think some of the scores of reporters standing out there in their parkas were wondering. It was held outdoors, I believe 28 degrees at that time in the nation's capital. George Santos facing an expulsion vote at truly any moment, although we expect it will happen tomorrow. He had preemptively scheduled this a couple of weeks back, knowing what was coming after the Ethics Committee released this scathing report that has more people talking about Botox and OnlyFans than policy. And guess what? Big surprise, everybody. He's not going anywhere. Here he is.
Because if I leave, they win. If I leave, the bullies take place. This is bullying. The chair of the committee putting out a motion to expel, just introducing it and not calling it privilege, was designed to force me to resign. But he didn't even have the fortitude to go ahead and call the privilege. He had someone else do it, someone who's actually just recently done one on me, which is Congressman D'Esposito. So the reality of it is it's all theater.
It's all theater. And he loves theater. He actually showed up with the goods today. George Santos says not only will he not resign, and he better act quick on this because he'll probably be fired tomorrow, he's going to drop his own privileged resolution to expel Congressman Jamal Bowman, his colleague from New York, a Democrat. You remember this is the guy who pulled the fire alarm in the House? Let's reassemble the panel. I'm sure Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are looking forward to talking about this. Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, Republicans fire George Santos tomorrow. Is that inevitable?
Well, I think it's Congress will fire George Santos tomorrow. You need a 2/3 vote. Republicans can't do it on its own. But I don't know any Democrats who think it's a good idea for him to stick around either. So yeah, I would anticipate him being gone by the weekend. And I think I watched that press conference. I kept scratching my head wondering what we talking about. All these things that he was going to release that were going to clear everything up, and yet he couldn't name a single one of them, couldn't name a single member he was talking about who had violated the law. Honestly, a horrible waste of perfectly good airtime from what I can tell.
Well, yeah. He said a lot more than what we just played here, Jeannie. And of course, this is your state of New York we're talking about. I want you to weigh in on this. He suggests that he's going to blow the lid off here on any number of members who have misbehaved and abused their power in Congress. Are you feeling or seeing a different George Santos here? He really does seem to be freed by this whole getting fired moment. He's got a sense of humor. He's breezy with reporters. He seems to be living his best life on the eve of his firing. Jeannie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think he's really found his stride here. He maybe didn't even want to be in Congress. He wanted to be doing this. I loved the theater line you just played. I, too, got up early and got ready with my coffee and watched this. It was stunning. And, you know, theater, of which George Santos knows a lot. He knows theater when he sees it. His concern about bullying is, you know, really fascinating because now he's going after another congressman. So we'll have to wait and see if Bowman and any of the others describe his attacks on them as bullying.
Right.
You know, George Santos is the gift that keeps on giving. I think we're going to miss him when he goes. We'll miss the balloon, but I think we'll probably see him back on the air in some capacity or another, doing what he does best, theater. He'll be find his way.
I know there could be jail time involved. We have a criminal proceeding to work out here. Rick, does he have a future in media? Where do you see George Santos? There's got to be a network somewhere to hire him.
I think he's got a future in Leavenworth. I think you're going to have to get an appointment to go see him, and you can only talk to him through a telephone. I mean, that guy's going to jail. I mean, there's no future for him. He's violated every rule in the book, and he's going to get the book thrown at him. So I think it's all going to be sort of overtaken by events by the weekend. I would say the one stunning thing this week is the disappointment that I know I have and shared by other Republicans that the Speaker Johnson has taken sort of this approach that is, oh, you know, give the guy his due process. This is a bad example to set. And I must say that does not harken well for leadership.
Interesting. So you would have liked to see him take a harder line.
I would like to see him clean out the House of Representatives. I'd like to see him create a body that actually can work. And George Santos is an impediment to getting things done. And he should just be a steamroller and roll through all these crazy caucuses within our party that are stopping things from happening, and each individual who's just a performance artist.
Well, you know, I have to admit, I mean, Jeannie, Rick Davis has talked about the House in colorful form for a couple of years on this broadcast, noting the real difference between the House and the Senate. You know, there are true criminals in many cases walking around in the House. It's kind of the nature of the beast here. But Santos says, if you expel me, it will be the undoing, that was his line, of many House members. Who are you watching?
You know, I don't know, because he couldn't name any. You know, the
Fair.
reality is this is part of the powers that the House has to control their membership. They have every right to do it. I think there is actually a fair question to be asked whether this is the precedent they want to set, getting rid of somebody before they've been convicted. That's a fair thing to ask. But if 2/3 agree, and I think they will tomorrow, it's really a done deal. And, you know, I don't know if Mike Johnson is going to be able to do what Rick has suggested. It may be a good thing to do, but he has not shown the ability to do anything of the sort. I mean, the idea that we know that he tried to talk to George Santos and get him to resign, and George Santos rebuffed it, is not a good sign for Mike Johnson. It goes back to what we were just talking about. He's still in like the later half of his honeymoon, but I think there's big questions about his ability to control his own caucus. And he has a lot on his plate as he goes forward into the new year.
Rick, we have less than a minute left here. Do you want to go back and restate what you just said? Are you looking to eliminate the House of Representatives? How could you even describe a place like that we call the House?
No, I wouldn't. That would be too disappointing to not have something to talk about every day if they were gone. But I just think that they need to be able to be organized in a fashion through the rules of the House and through leadership to actually be productive. This is the least productive Congress in the last 2 years that I can remember.
Well, that's just saying a lot. I need more time with the panel. I know you feel the same way. I had 10 other things I wanted to bring up, but we'll look ahead at the main event tonight. Could this be the advantage Ron DeSantis has been waiting for, or his undoing? He's about to find out. talk to Rick and Jeannie. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Starbucks is making it easier for employees to pause mobile orders in response to staffing concerns, an issue that has contributed to repeated protests by unionized baristas. Now, according to a document seen by Bloomberg, reasons for a halt include higher than expected volume or when employee absences are, quote, negatively impacting the Starbucks experience. Sources tell Bloomberg Occidental Petroleum is in talks to buy shale driller Crown Rock. And with more on that story, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, it comes as the consolidation wave in North America's most prolific oil field gathers momentum. Crown Rock is one of the larger, closely held oil and gas producers in the Permian Basin, North America's biggest source of crude. Output from that region of West Texas and New Mexico has doubled in just 6 years to the point where it yields more oil on a daily basis than OPEC heavyweight Iraq. If the purchase is successful, it would augment a portfolio Occidental had already expanded with the $38 billion takeover of Anadarko Petroleum Corp in 2019. That deal was aided by an investment by Occidental's biggest shareholder, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. Charlie.
And that's Steve Rappaport reporting. Occidental Petroleum trading lower by 1.7%. Crude oil moving lower today, along with other oil stocks. AbbVie is acquiring Immunogen for $10.1 billion in a move aimed at gaining access to some of the hottest new drugs in the cancer market. AbbVie up 2.3%. Immunogen surging 82.5%. Those are our top company stories. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. Thanks for joining on the fastest show in politics. Covfefe is legitimized. We'll talk about it next with the panel after we check world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. We continue to remember Henry Kissinger, the Nixon-era Secretary of State and longtime private diplomat, died yesterday at the age of 100. Bloomberg News editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite interviewed Kissinger just this year. He says he was a giant on the world stage.
He was someone very obviously in terms of legacy who changed the world through the bringing China back into some kind of unity with the West and bringing China in from the cold. I think that was a huge deal.
You can hear more of John Micklethwaite's reflections on the life and legacy of Henry Kissinger on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his own shuttle diplomacy mission today, meeting again with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. The two sides have extended their temporary pause for another 24 hours so that additional hostages and prisoners can be released. Already today, Israel has released 2 of the expected 10 hostages to be freed today. Israel will also release more prisoners. The 2023 Atlantic hurricane season ends today. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is calling it an above-normal season. The 20 named storms are the 4th highest since 1950. And the World Meteorological Association has declared 2023 the warmest year ever recorded. And the year isn't even over yet. We get more from Bloomberg's Amy Morris.
Researchers say global temperatures were about 1.4 degrees Celsius, or 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the pre-industrial average for the first 10 months of the year. That provides enough certainty to declare it the hottest year on record, even with a month left to go. The increasing heat is worsening extreme weather, that is, in turn, causing deaths and food insecurity and displacing millions. The report is a stark warning to world leaders gathering for the COP28 climate summit. Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe.
Nancy, thank you. It was May 31st, 2017, a day in history when we all read the tweet about Covfefe. Remember this? President Trump at the time, May 31, 2017, the tweet read, "Despite the constant negative press, Covfefe." And there it ended. He tweeted it right after midnight, generating the headline in the New York Times, "Trump tweet unites bewildered nation." In The Guardian, the tweet by Donald Trump that baffled the internet. Covfefe is now a real thing. I just want you to know this. The new site Public Square, there's the MAGA Mart that we can go shopping. This is the Don Jr. thing where you go shopping online for Trump-themed items. Now has for sale coffee from a company called Covfefe. Not the most important campaign story of the day, though. Close. But it all happens at 9 o'clock tonight, and I'm wondering if this is going to be a new beginning or possibly the end for Ron DeSantis. The Fox red versus blue state debate tonight between Ron DeSantis and Gavin Newsom happens a couple of hours from now. They can thank me later for the promotion. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano in our final couple of minutes here. Rick, is this not a risky move by Ron DeSantis? Could this go very wrong tonight?
It could go wrong for both of them if they don't perform well.
Gavin Newsom's not running, though.
But he might, and he's an elected governor, so he's got just as much to lose about his future as the others. And the reality is that this is also an opportunity for him to both cement a legacy that could actually help them politically in their futures, including for Ron DeSantis, this election cycle.
Yeah, right. What do you think here, Jeannie? Does Gavin Newsom start a whole new round of talk about jumping in the race after this?
Oh, I don't think so. I think this is very, very risky for the governor. His statement made it seem like it's all over anyways and that he's looking to the future. But Joe, I know what I'm getting you and Rick for Christmas now. I'm getting you kafefe from the MAGA Mart along with a onesie rifle adorned for the baby.
I saw that on there.
Not so good.
Listen, Jeannie, thank you for taking a hint. Jeannie Shanzana with the Christmas list. She knows what we want, Rick Davis. The signature panel on Sound On. Thanks to you both. Hour 2 starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Is a government shutdown suddenly less likely? Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. As the conservative House Freedom Caucus drops its opposition now to spending levels back from the debt ceiling deal. We'll discuss the implications with Mark Goldwine at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget with insights from Bloomberg Politics reporter Mike Dorning in Washington. The truce between Israel and Hamas may be on the rocks. It could end tonight. We'll have the latest on what's happening overseas from Bloomberg national security reporter Nick Wadhams and take a look at what could come next. All this after a look at Wall Street. Let's get up to date on trading now with the help of Charlie Pellet here in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. We have got stocks trading mixed right now with the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It is higher. We've got the S&P, NASDAQ. They are both moving lower right now. NASDAQ 100 index down 0.8%. NASDAQ Composite Index down 0.9%. S&P 500 index lower by 6, drop there of 0.1%. And the Dow holding onto a gain of 315 points, up 0.9%. Certainly Salesforce.com after earnings helping lift the Dow today. Salesforce now up by 7.6%. As we move into the final trading month of 2023, what is ahead for stocks in the new year? Stephen Whiting is Chief Investment Strategist at Citigroup Private Bank.
We think that a broadening equity market is the way that we will see the markets in 2024. It's not that we're going to get another 18-19% gain in the S&P 500, but most stocks will be looking forward to a broader earnings recovery.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Ford has restored financial guidance, saying profits will come in lower than earlier projections due to rising labor costs from its new contract with the United Auto Workers Union. Ford shares, they're down now by 3.6%. VinFast Auto shares are trading higher again today with the Vietnamese electric vehicle maker on track for its 7th straight day of gains. Again, recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P 500 index down 7, drop now of 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.33%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you as always. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York. Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. With an eye on Israel and what could happen in the next few hours could be pivotal here. It does feel different now than it did at this time yesterday when there was hope, there was optimism for an extension of what is now a week-long truce. That optimism doesn't seem to be in the air quite the extent like we saw yesterday. And it has a lot to do with the confusion that led to just the one-day extension last evening. Israel wasn't happy with the information on hostages that it was receiving from Hamas. There's great distrust here, and of course, we're working through intermediaries, and it's very difficult to follow the bead from what is clearly a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour situation, and that's why we wanted to get the take of Nick Wadhams, of course, Bloomberg's national security reporter, working out of Washington and joining us now on Sound On. Nick, it's great to see you, and thank you for your time. Is it likely that this ends tonight?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one, obviously, that we are all trying to figure out the answer to. You know, there are a lot of questions here. For one thing, Secretary of State Tony Blinken is in the region. It would be a bad look for Israel to end this truce while he's there. So there is some impetus to have at least another extension with the U.S. Secretary of State there. He also was dropping the hammer a little bit on the Israelis, saying, yes, you should have the ability to proceed with the counter against Hamas. But, at the same time, it must be done in accordance with international humanitarian law. So that was a shift in tone and emphasis. The other issue that I'm thinking about is, it's not clear how many more hostages Hamas actually has to trade. So the truce has operated under the premise that Hamas would release about 10 people every day in exchange for 30 Palestinians in Israeli jails. And how many more people do they have to keep that up? It's a big question.
It's really an important point, because it seemed to really become clear last evening, Nick, that Hamas did not have the information that Israel thought it did. Israel believes 145 hostages are still being held in Gaza. Does anyone know where they are?
Well, the big issue there is, there may be 145 hostages, but the terms of this truce were really around the idea of Hamas freeing women and children. Yeah. And there were believed to be 70 or 80 women and children, but also the issue was that some were held by Hamas, some were held by Islamic Jihad. So what you saw over the last couple of weeks, the reason why this was so fraught, was the U.S. and Israel really pressing Hamas to give them the list of names of people who they would be able to release, and also to acknowledge that maybe there were a lot of people they didn't know where they were, whether they were still alive, who was holding them. So the idea was, okay, you release the folks you've got, and that also gives time for Hamas to basically get a sense for where those other people are and to be able to release them too. But the big question for this truce is, if they want to extend it, they're going to have to start looking at the possibility of releasing men, releasing Israeli soldiers. That's going to be a lot more complicated.
Well, I'll tell you, once the fighting does resume, and that seems to be the determination on both sides here, Benjamin Netanyahu says, under no circumstances will we not finish this job. Hamas says October 7th was a dress rehearsal, Nick. And you wonder if there's any hope for hostages once fighting resumes. How could they possibly be protected?
Well, I mean, that's the big question that we're all trying to figure out, because it would look, if Israel presses ahead with the campaign and then also moves further south, there's going to be an even larger humanitarian outcry, because all of the civilians who fled north of Gaza, where did they go? They went south. And if Israel presses the campaign into the south, you're going to see more civilian casualties. Obviously, the location of a lot of those hostages is unknown. Maybe they're in the north, but maybe they're also in the south. We don't know where Hamas is. So that's why you hear Blinken ramping up his admonitions. And, the U.S. idea really being, listen, Israel says it's going to take as long as it takes to do this, but the U.S., I think, has a much shorter time horizon here. They're saying, listen, you have days or weeks to press ahead with this campaign. This is not going to be a months-long thing. Just the support is not going to be there, especially as you push south. So that's all questions they're grappling with.
Lastly, Nick Wadhams, is the CIA director, is Bill Burns still in Qatar? And how significant is that? He seems to be the center of at least our contribution to this deal.
Well, I mean, the CIA does not give, much to our chagrin, does not give day-to-day updates on his whereabouts. But as far as we last knew, he was there. I mean, what you're seeing here is just, I find completely fascinating, because it shows that the CIA director, very seasoned diplomat, a career foreign service officer before his retirement, and then he joined the CIA. I mean, he is just absolutely the linchpin of this administration's efforts, and it looks like he has gained the trust of all sides. Obviously, he has the advantage. Unlike the Secretary of State, he can fly relatively incognito and doesn't have to take a passel of journalists with him anywhere he goes. But he clearly has the knowledge, the background, that he helped negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. So, he's got the experience to be able to do this. I think Biden's feeling is, safe to say, if anybody can get it done, it's Bill Burns.
Isn't that amazing? I think this is going to end up being an amazing story. I realize it could take years for it to be told. Nick, maybe you'll write the book. But that's got to be an incredible room to be in, to be a fly on the wall.
Indeed.
Nick Wadhams, Bloomberg National Security Team Leader. You got that right. It's great to see you, my friend. Thank you for joining. Of course, from Washington, I'm Joe Matthew at Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. The other big story we're balancing here has to do with what's taking place in Washington, the funding battle. Not just to fund Israel and Ukraine, but to keep the government open past January. And we've got a lot to work through here. There is a headline, as we told you, that the chair of the Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry, came out in front of the cameras abandoning demands for broad spending cuts that were included in the debt ceiling deal. Remember, they established a top-line number there. The Freedom Caucus thought it was still too high. Apparently, they're good with $1.59 trillion. Kevin McCarthy saying, "Why did I get fired again?" And we want to bring in Mark Goldwine, the Senior Vice President, Senior Policy Director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Mark, it's great to see you. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Great to have you back on Bloomberg. Does this make you more optimistic about avoiding a government shutdown?
Well, we certainly narrowed the disagreement. The Senate still wants to spend at least $14 billion more than the deal. And even though the House says they want to take the Fiscal Responsibility Act deal, they've said they don't want to do a number of these side deals that increase the actual number. So there still is a pretty significant gulf between the House and the Senate, but it's much narrower than it was before. And I think they'll be able to close it, at least on a temporary basis.
So what's your feel on this in general with the laddered CR? We haven't talked to you since this idea first emerged here. We're going to start running out of money at the end of January. We will completely run out of money in February. Do you see another swing at a CR, or can they get a bunch of spending bills done between now and then?
Yeah, I think of the laddered CR more as rolling shutdowns, right? But it's really just two sets of bills that are very close together. So at the end of the day, they need a deal one way or another by late January. My best guess is we don't get it done in time and we do another CR, because that's just that's how Congress normally operates. But there's a path. There's a path to get full appropriations done. And the Defense Department, I think, is really starting to turn the screws, because when they're operating under a CR, there's very limited what they're able to do.
Yeah, the fact that the NDAA has become as political as it has tells us a lot about where we are. And there's the matter of supplemental funding that I already mentioned before you came on today, Mark, about Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and it seems to all be hinging on an agreement on the border. It's something that I talked about yesterday with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York. This is a Republican voice. Listen to what she said.
The Republicans certainly want border security, but we're willing to work with the Democrats on more visas to make sure people can come and work legally. We do have an employment issue in our country where we have a worker shortage. This can be addressed. It could be a win-win if we do it right.
Mark, what do you think about this? It appears Democrats are opening their minds to the idea of asylum law changes. I realize there are sticking points when it comes to parole, but could we have a grand bargain on border security that would then allow everything else we just mentioned to fall in place?
Well, I don't know if there's going to be a grand bargain, although, the idea of securing the border better and increasing immigration for, in certain cases, I think has been long explored and would be smart for the economy. But it's possible that a mini bargain on immigration or on the border could open the door to other funding, including for Ukraine and for Israel. I know there's a separate issue that the House does not want to vote for Ukraine and Israel together, and the president doesn't want them separately. That's not insurmountable. I mean, the House could pass two different packages, send them to the president the same day. He can sign them in the same ceremony and they both win. But it is a challenge.
Well, I'll tell you, it's not the development that I expected today in terms of the Freedom Caucus here, and it makes me wonder your thoughts on how the speaker's doing. Mike Johnson got a pretty tough piece in Politico that a lot of folks are talking about here, that the conservative right in the House is not impressed with his job so far. And what you just suggested, maybe another CR could mean he gets fired and follow in the path of Kevin McCarthy, doesn't it?
Look, he's been at the job for like 6 legislative days. I think, so you wouldn't have your job review when you'd only been working for 2 weeks. And
not everyone has your patience.
So it's time will tell, but it's far too early to make any kind of judgments one way or another.
Well, maybe it is for you or for serious individuals, but it's his conference he needs to worry about. And I just wonder if that idea of a motion to vacate is still on your menu of options, or if that's something that is going to rest with Kevin McCarthy.
I think that the pressure against doing that again is so strong. I don't think they want to go through that again. It was very painful And so he'd have to do something, I think, pretty bad to get a motion to vacate and be vacated. Although you never know.
You never know. As we spend time with Mark Goldwine from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, this is the part where I'll get a bunch of nasty grams, Mark, but I have to ask you because I realize it's part of your view here at the committee. When we start talking about budgeting, when we start talking about eliminating deficits, we never talk about revenue, should we?
Yeah, well, no, we are talking about revenue right now. We're talking about tax cuts.
Well, that's right.
Raising
revenue, to be clear.
Yeah, apparently Democrats and Republicans want to come together and cut $800 billion more of taxes at the end of the year for businesses and for the child tax credit. This is exactly the wrong conversation. We are running $2 trillion deficits. Interest rates are 4.5%, 5%. And we're talking about tax cuts. That's crazy.
But if you say I'm going to raise taxes, you don't get elected, right?
Well, look, I mean, one way or another, we're going to have to close the gap between taxes and spending, and none of it's going to be popular. It's not popular to cut Social Security or cut defense or raise taxes, but it's also not popular to run massive deficits that lead to inflation, that lead to higher interest rates, that slow income growth, that put our trust funds in danger. So at some point, they're going to have to choose to do an unpopular thing to prevent an even more unpopular thing from happening.
Well, so does the committee have a position on this? Would it include, for instance, rescinding the 2017 Trump tax cuts? Would that close the gap on a level that would please you?
Well, those tax cuts are already scheduled to expire in 2 years. So rescinding them wouldn't save very much money. But as a first step, we shouldn't extend any of those tax cuts unless we have pay-fors. We should look carefully. Look, some of them were good. It was a whole package. It did lots of things. Some was good, some was bad. We should extend the good, build on the okay, ditch the bad, and pay for it. But all that's going to do is stop things from getting worse. We're actually going to need to raise taxes. That's going to have to mean cutting tax breaks more seriously, raising rates, looking at other kinds of taxes, maybe a carbon tax. And then that's not going to solve it. Also, we're also going to look at the spending side, get healthcare costs under control, extend our appropriations caps, make Social Security solvent. None of this stuff is going to be super popular because we've overpromised. We are promising more in government programs than we're raising in taxes, and something has got to give.
You're going to have some chippy interviews in 2 years when that debate starts all over again. It'll be even sooner than that, I'm sure. It's just, it's very interesting to me that we don't even have the conversation on most days when people are wringing their hands about deficits and debt in this country. And look, I guess this could take on a lot of different forms here, Mark Goldwine, but at some point, we're going to have to get into it as we continue to kick the can. He's the Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. It's good to see you, Mark. Thank you for joining and sharing insights today here on Bloomberg Sound On. It's the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York, rubbing elbows with the rich and famous here at Bloomberg. On the radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, we invite you right now. Super cool cameras up here. Super cool studio. They call it the Fishbowl. Join us inside. Search Bloomberg Global News on YouTube, and we'll meet you here. Coming up, we're going to actually go back to Washington to connect with Mike Dorning, Bloomberg Politics reporter, his view on what's happening today inside the House of Representatives, what might happen tomorrow to George Santos, and whether he thinks this budget battle will end in a shutdown. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Best level of the day right now on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. While the S&P hits a wall, we have got the S&P trading lower by 4 points, down by about less than 0.1%. The Dow, though, up 332 points. That is a gain of 0.9%. Salesforce, after earnings, helping lift the Dow Jones Industrial Average. We've got Salesforce shares pushing higher now by just about 8.25%. NASDAQ lower by 100 points, down 0.7%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 124 points, a drop now of 0.8%. The 10-year yield is at 4.33%, with a 2-year yielding 4.70%. Spot gold down $8 the ounce to $20.35, down 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude is down 2.7%, $75.77 for a barrel of WTI. So it is a mixed day right now, with the Dow higher, the S&P and NASDAQ both trading lower. What is the difference between Coke and Pepsi for job seekers? Coca-Cola offers the best career mobility out of nearly 400 big employers, according to a new 5-year analysis of 4.7 million workers. Rival PepsiCo came in 19th on that same list. The data comes from the American Opportunity Index, a product of Harvard Business School, the Schultz Family Foundation, and Burning Glass Institute, a labor-focused nonprofit. Shares of Coca-Cola, they're up now by 0.4%. PepsiCo up by 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
You guys remember the Pepsi Challenge back in the 1980s? Charlie, you take the Pepsi Challenge?
I remember it well from TV. I'm just thinking,
do.
Yeah, but how about a Pepsi Challenge for the best place to work?
Well, yeah, you've got me thinking about this now. I remember, it wasn't just a commercial. I remember they came to my little town where I grew up to set up the table in front of the local Kmart. I took the Pepsi Challenge, and I picked Coke.
There you go. And I thought you were going to say RC Cola.
They were not. Oh, see, that's actually, now you're getting close to home, Charlie. You are such a Northeasterner. Charlie Pellet. I'm actually in the same room as the great Mr. Pellet here today at World Headquarters in New York. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us.
And the feeling is mutual,
well,
Joe
thank
Matthew.
you, my friend. We'll come back to Charlie and get an update on the markets in just a couple. I wonder what George Santos had for breakfast this morning. Maybe it was Pepsi. Because, boy, he was raring to go. 28 degrees outside, a gaggle of reporters on the steps of the Capitol waiting for the gentleman from New York. They thought maybe he'd resign. Speaker gave him the chance. They're not going to vote till tomorrow now. And he did not. George Santos, in fact, turned around, looked at the Capitol, talked about the bullies inside that building, and said he would be their undoing if they expelled him. And he's going to start with a colleague from New York. George Santos says he'll go after Jamal Bowman for pulling that fire alarm. Here he is from this morning.
But Jamal Bowman gets a pass. That's why today at noon, I'm going to be introducing a privilege motion for expulsion of convicted and guilty pleaded Congressman Jamal Bowman. And I stand there. I think that that's consistency. Let's hold our own accountable, but let's make sure that we do it with the precedent of the House. Now, if the House wants to start different precedent and expel me, that is going to be the undoing of a lot of members of this body because this will haunt them in the future.
So you fire me, I'm taking as many of you with me as I can, starting with Jamal. His vote will come first, though. Mike Dorning joins us from Washington. He actually covers this for a living. Bloomberg politics reporter. Mike, you've covered the Hill for a while here. I'm guessing you've never seen anything quite like this. James Traficant can say, beam me up all day long, but he's no George Santos. He will be fired tomorrow. I think we can assume that. What happens then?
Well, then the New York governor will have to have a special election within 90 days. This is a seat that tends to be more Democratic. It was unusual that they elected a Republican congressman. It's not like that experience has necessarily been a great one for the district. So there's thought that the Democrats are more likely to win it. And then, and this is something that weighs on the Speaker of the House, of course, Mike Johnson, the Republicans will only be able to lose 3 votes and prevail in a party line vote instead of only being able to lose 4 votes. So things get tougher for the Republican leaders.
Is he going to ruin other political careers while he's at it? He didn't name names, Mike, other than Jamal Bowman. Do we have any idea who he's talking about, the undoing, he said, of many House members?
It's unclear whether he's actually going to name names and make specific allegations. The Jamal Bowman thing was kind of silly because everyone knows about that. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor. Usually when people are kicked out of Congress, it's for things like treason against the United States in the Civil War, or, crimes involving theft or deceit and fraud and things that are at least felonies.
Well, yeah, and that's why he says they're setting a new precedent here, of course. But does Jamal Bowman have something to worry about? I can't think there's a 2/3 majority to expel him, but you tell me.
He has nothing to worry about. There's no way any Democrats are going to vote to expel him. You can't get a 2/3 majority without both parties, or at least substantial members of both parties voting to expel. So the only way you can expel a member of the House is if there is cross-party desire to do that.
Yeah. Spoke yesterday with Nicole Malliotakis, the congresswoman from New York. Mike, here's what she said. Remember, this is the same delegation and, of course, the same party. Her reaction now, having read that ethics committee report into George Santos. Here's Nicole Malliotakis.
We have to take action and remove him. Now, he will have his day in court as it relates to the criminal charges.
Right.
But in terms of being able to continue his service in Congress, we believe we have seen enough and that he does not merit to continue serving in this body, and his constituents do deserve better.
You get a sense that Republicans actually see political advantage in doing this, or at least disadvantage in not doing it, Mike.
I think you're right on the second point. They see disadvantage in not doing it. And politics, like business, you got to deal with the reality that you've got. They might wish that, things were obfuscated and they could have this extra vote. And certainly they went along the last year, trying to keep him in there. But now you've got this ethics report finding substantial evidence to back up these really salacious allegations about, using campaign money on a, website associated with pornography, big Hermes bills, paying for a honeymoon. It's just going to be too much political trouble for the Republicans to go through another year of having George Santos as one of the sort of faces of the Republican Party for the country. So they just have to take the hit and do it, I think, is what most of them have concluded.
Well, there's a lawmaker who's causing trouble for the Republican Party in the other chamber, Mike, and that would be Tommy Tuberville, the senator from Alabama. His lone man blockade against military promotions to protest the abortion travel policy at the Pentagon. A lot of reporting now. He's talking to colleagues behind the scenes, says, I'll get you guys out of this. I started it. He's looking for an off-ramp, is the reporting, Mike. And it's been suggested he might end his block on all promotions except those for 4-star generals. I don't know how many individuals that represents, but is that what you see coming?
I mean, that is somewhat of a reasonable off-ramp, but still going to be a problem for the military, because I'm not because essentially what Tuberville then wants Schumer to do is burn up all this time in the Senate for every 4-star general, because the 4-star generals are obviously more important. That's why they have 4 stars. But you don't really want to still be gumming up, the regional commanders, the CENTCOM, the Pacific Fleet Commander, all these very important military roles. So that might not be enough for Democrats, but maybe it'd be enough for the Republicans to at least stand down for a bit. It's hard to see this not continuing to damage Republicans if they don't just completely make this go away.
It's amazing that we're still talking about this, Mike. You spent a lot of years
embedded with military units in combat. You have a real sense of this story. It's amazing to me how many months a single senator has done this for.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I mean, if I did spend a lot of time in Iraq embedded with the Marine Corps and Army units, it is kind of crazy. It's sort of crazy because it's a vestige of the Constitution. Like every single general, every single admiral, every flag officer, every general officer has to be confirmed by Congress, and you really do gum up the works here. That said, it's really an illustration of the change in the Republican Party over the last 10 or 15 years, because this probably isn't actually hurting the senator in his home state of Alabama. Because the Republican Party, for many years, going back to Reagan and for decades afterwards, was associated with strong national defense, strong support for the military. But this sort of populist turn the party has taken, in part out of reaction against the involvement in Iraq, but also as Trump became, a leader of the party, is now not so national defense oriented. And you can see this in splits in spending between sort of the hawks and the populists. And here you have a senator who really is elected by this socially conservative populist movement in a state like Alabama, and there are other states like that, that this is probably not so damaging to him, even though there's strong support for the military in Alabama. These social conservative issues, these grievances against Democrats really are what's animating this one wing of the party.
Absolutely.
So it really marks a change in the Republican Party, or it's reflective of it, and this tension between Tuberville and the other senators reflects that tension between the old wing of the Republican Party and the new wing.
Yeah, we have to remember he's been raising money on this all year. Mike, thank you for joining, as always. Live from Washington, Mike Dorning, Bloomberg politics reporter, with us on Sound On. We get you up to date on everything else that's popping today. World and national news now with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Hamas is once again freeing Israeli hostages in exchange for more Palestinian prisoners to be released. This is part of a last-minute deal to extend the ceasefire in Gaza by another day. It's unclear how long this will keep going, but U.S. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says they will keep negotiating.
We're working on it literally by the hour to see if we can get this seventh day turned into an eighth and ninth and 10th and beyond. But all I can do is tell you where we are right now, and we're glad that we got a seventh day out of this.
National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. Families of the hostages are pressing Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to bring home more hostages, while his far-right governing partners are pushing him to resume the war until Hamas is destroyed. Well, on the brink of being expelled from Congress for ethics concerns, New York Republican George Santos has taken steps to expel Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman for pleading guilty to a misdemeanor for pulling a fire alarm before a House vote. Santos says, unlike himself, Bowman was actually convicted of a crime. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Best level of the day right now on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, up 363 points. We have got the S&P little changed, down now by half a point. NASDAQ remains in the red, down by 93 points, a drop there of just about 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 index also lower, down now by 0.7%. This month's $3 trillion rally in the S&P 500 is struggling to gain further traction. Traders giving a lukewarm response today to the bolstered bets the Fed is done with its hiking cycle. 10-year yield now 4.33%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.70%. Gold down $7 the ounce to $20.36, down by about 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil trading lower by 2.3%, $76.05 for a barrel of WTI. Fresh government data cast doubt on some of the U.S. labor market outlook, and with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The total number of people on unemployment rolls rose to the highest in 2 years, 1.9 million in mid-November. That suggests out-of-work Americans are finding it more difficult to secure new jobs. New jobless claims are also up. The unemployment rate is on the rise, reaching 3.9% in October, the highest since January 2022. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Amcor Technology plans to build a $2 billion semiconductor advanced packaging facility in Arizona, an investment that could generate as many as 2,000 jobs and bolster the Phoenix region's status as an American chip-making hub. Shares of Amcor, they're down by 0.8%. Ford shares, they are in the red. Ford restored financial guidance today, but it said profits will come in lower than earlier projections because of rising labor costs from its new contract with the United Auto Workers Union. Ford shares down now by just about 3%. Again, recapping, we do have stocks trading mixed with the S&P 500 index unchanged now. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We talk about the race just about every day here on this program. The race for president, of course. My God, we've got the big debate tonight between Ron DeSantis and Gavin Newsom. But there's another race that's getting enormous attention today on the terminal, and just a great story from our team here in New York. I'm Joe Matthew in New York today. I'm lucky to be at World Headquarters once again, and glad that I can bring you with me here on the fastest show in politics. The headline says it all. New York City mayor's woes are so bad, and I mentioned this before, not to interrupt my own headline here. Talked about it. It's so bad even Andrew Cuomo is eyeing a run. Here's the thing. That's the fun part that people talk about. That gets everybody going in the media, spun up about Andrew Cuomo. But the fact of the matter is, it's like a dozen people running for a seat that was supposed to be in the hands for some time, in the hands of Eric Adams. Joining us to talk about this off the triple byline, Laura Namias in the Bloomberg New York Bureau, senior reporter covering New York City and New York State politics. Laura, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
And sharing a great story with us here. Look, 12? How many candidates do we have here who think they might be the next mayor of New York?
I think it's a little closer to 8 or 9.
Yeah.
Still a significant number with the
There shouldn't be one at the moment, right?
Yeah, it's almost, it's like 18 months until the primary election, and so that's a pretty significant number at this point in the race.
You refer to political blood in the water.
Yeah.
It's been a tough run here recently for Eric Adams.
Indeed.
When it comes to accusations of fraud, and you could tell us even more, never mind the migrant crisis that has gripped the city.
Yeah, well, we don't know exactly what he